Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a sound that exists nowhere else in the known galaxy. It is not quite a hum, not quite a scream, not quite the grinding of ancient metal against itself. It lives somewhere between all of those things, somewhere in the spaces where definition breaks down and meaning begins to rot. It is the sound of a chaos warship at rest, if rest is even possible for a vessel that has spent 10,000 years drinking in the raw madness of the warp. If you pressed your ear against the rusted bulkhead of such a ship, you would hear it. You would hear the slow pulse of something that might be an engine or might be a heartbeat. You would hear the distant wailing of voices that could belong to the damned or to the hull itself, groaning under the weight of millennia. And if you listened long enough, and if you let that sound settle into the marrow of your bones and the folds of your brain, you would begin to understand something that the Imperium of man has tried very hard to forget. These ships are alive. Not alive the way you or I understand the word. Not alive the way a tree is alive or a dog is alive, or even the way a particularly clever servitor might mimic the appearance of life. They are alive the way a nightmare is alive, the way a fever dream persists even after you open your eyes and find yourself drenched in sweat and shaking in the dark. They remember things, they hunger for things, and they have been sailing the space between stars for longer than most civilizations have existed. Tonight, we are going to walk the corridors of these vessels. We are going to breathe the recycled air that tastes of copper and ozone and something else, something sweeter and more terrible that has no name in any human language. We are going to meet the creatures that call these ships home, from the towering demigods in their corroded power armor to the wretched slaves who crawl through maintenance shafts no wider than coffins. We are going to explore what daily existence looks like aboard a vessel that has been touched by the gods of chaos, and we are going to do it slowly, carefully, because these are not places that reward haste. Haste gets you noticed, and being noticed on a chaos ship is very rarely a good thing. So settle in, get comfortable, and let us begin our descent into the belly of the beast. To understand what life is like aboard a chaos warship, you first need to understand what these vessels actually are. And that means going back a very long way, back to a time before the corruption, before the betrayal, before the long fall into darkness that split the Imperium in half and sent 9 legions of superhuman warriors screaming into the embrace of gods that should never have been named. Most chaos warships were not built by the forces of chaos. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about them. The vast majority of these vessels began their existence in the shipyards of the Imperium itself, constructed by the hands of loyal servants of the Emperor during the Great Crusade, or in the millennia that followed. They were built to carry humanity's finest warriors across the stars, to bring light to worlds shrouded in darkness, to serve as instruments of a dream that was as beautiful as it was doomed. The shipyards of Luna, the orbital foundries of Mars, the great dockyards of Saturn, these were the cradles where these vessels first drew power. Mechanicum artisans, the finest engineers humanity had ever produced, poured their genius and their devotion into every rivet, every weld, every carefully calibrated system. These ships were works of art as much as they were instruments of war. Their hulls gleamed with the promise of a golden age, and their engines burned with the fire of human ambition. And then the heresy came. When Horus Lupercal, the emperor's most trusted son, turned his back on his father and embraced the whispered promises of the chaos gods, he did not do so alone. Fully half of the Space Marine legions followed him into damnation, and they brought their fleets with them. Thousands of warships, from sleek frigates to massive battleships, were carried into the Eye of Terror in the wake of the traitors' defeat at the Siege of Terror. These vessels, built to serve the brightest dream humanity had ever conceived, became the chariots of its darkest nightmare. But the corruption did not happen overnight. It crept, it seeped, It whispered. Picture a ship, if you will. A grand cruiser, perhaps, one of the old designs from before the Great Crusade. She was beautiful once. Her hull was clean and angular, her weapon batteries arranged with mathematical precision, her interior decorated with the symbols of the Imperium and the legion she served. Her corridors were lit with steady, reliable lumens. Her air recyclers hummed with quiet efficiency. Her crew, tens of thousands of men and women, went about their duties with the discipline and purpose that defined life in service to the Emperor. Now fast forward 10,000 years. The hull is no longer clean. It has been scarred by uncountable battles, patched with materials that were never meant to be used for ship repair, materials that seem to have grown rather than been installed. In places, the metal has taken on an organic quality, as though the boundary between steel and flesh has become negotiable. Rust. The color of dried blood creeps across surfaces that were once polished to a mirror sheen, and in the deeper sections of the ship, where the warp has had the longest time to work its influence, the walls pulse with a slow, rhythmic movement that suggests something enormous breathing just on the other side. The weapon batteries still function after a fashion, though their targeting systems have been replaced by something less precise, but far more terrifying. Where once a machine spirit guided the shells to their targets with cold, mechanical accuracy, now something else lurks within the fire control systems. Something that takes pleasure in destruction. Something that howls with delight when the guns speak and screams with frustration when they fall silent. The corridors are dark. Not the darkness of a simple power failure, but an intentional, cultivated blackness that seems to have weight and substance. It presses against the skin. It fills the lungs. It whispers. The Night Lords, those sons of the sunless world of Nostramu, deliberately bred this darkness into their ships, as shutting down the lighting systems and forcing their human crew to adapt to a perpetual night that only their superhuman masters could truly navigate. But even aboard vessels that belong to other legions and warbands, the darkness has a way of gathering. Light sources flicker and die for no discernible reason. Shadows fall in directions that have nothing to do with the placement of lumens. And in the darkest corners, in the places where the crew have learned never to go, things move that have no business moving at all. The air. Let us talk about the air. On an Imperial warship, the atmospheric recyclers maintain a constant, carefully controlled environment. The air is clean, if somewhat metallic in taste, and it is circulated through vast networks of ducts and filters that keep the crew alive and functioning. On a Chaos warship, the air recyclers still function, mostly, but what they recycle has changed. The air aboard a ship of the Death Guard, for instance, is thick with the spores of diseases that have no names in any medical text. It tastes of rot and sweetness, like fruit left to decompose in the sun, and it carries within it the blessings of Nurgle, the Lord of Decay. Breathing this air does not kill you quickly. That would be too merciful. Instead, it works its way into your lungs, your blood, your bones, reshaping you cell by cell into something that the plague god finds pleasing. The crew of such vessels do not wear rebreathers. They have long since adapted to the pestilence that surrounds them, their bodies bloated and riddled with infection, but sustained by the terrible vitality of Nurgle's gifts. They do not feel pain as others feel it. They feel a kind of warmth, a sense of belonging, as though the disease that is consuming them is also embracing them, welcoming them into a family that will never abandon them. Aboard a ship dedicated to Khorne, the blood god, the air tastes of copper and iron, the unmistakable metallic tang of spilled blood. The recyclers strain to process an atmosphere that is perpetually contaminated by the violence that permeates every aspect of life aboard such a vessel. Fights break out constantly, not just between enemies, but between crewmates, between warriors who an hour ago fought side by side, but whose bloodlust has been stoked by the ever-present influence of the Skull Throne's occupant. The blood that is spilled is not always cleaned up. It pools in the corridors, it seeps into the deck plates, it becomes part of the ship itself. And in some sections, The walls are slick with it, the accumulated tribute of thousands of years of senseless slaughter. On vessels that served Tzeentch, the changer of ways, the air is different again. It crackles with psychic energy, tiny sparks of warp lightning that dance across exposed skin and leave the taste of ozone lingering on the tongue. The atmosphere seems to shift and change without warning, becoming thick and humid one moment, thin and cold the next, as though the ship's environmental systems are being manipulated by an intelligence that finds consistency boring. Crew members aboard Tzeentchian vessels report hearing whispers in languages they do not understand, fragments of knowledge that tantalize and torment in equal measure. Some go mad trying to decipher these whispers. Others find that the whispers begin to make a terrible kind of sense, and that is usually worse. And then there are the ships of Slaanesh, the Dark Prince. The air aboard these vessels is thick with scent, a constantly shifting perfume that moves from the sublime to the grotesque without warning. One breath might carry the scent of rare flowers from a garden world that no longer exists. The next might bring the smell of burning flesh and the chemical sharpness of exotic narcotics. The atmospheric systems aboard Slaaneshi vessels have been deliberately modified to deliver these sensory experiences, their filters removed and replaced with diffusers that pump intoxicating substances directly into the air supply. The crew breathe deeply, and their eyes glaze over, and the line between pleasure and agony becomes so thin that it ceases to exist at all. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can truly understand daily life aboard these vessels, we need to understand who lives aboard them. And that means talking about the hierarchy, the pecking order, the brutal social structure that determines who eats and who starves, who commands and who obeys, who lives and who dies at the whim of beings whose power is matched only by their cruelty. At the very top of this hierarchy, naturally, sits the Warband's Lord. This is the Chaos Lord, the Chaos Sorcerer, the Dark Apostle, or whatever title the leader has claimed or been granted by the Dark Gods. These are beings of terrifying power, warriors who have survived 10,000 years of constant warfare, whose bodies have been enhanced not only by the gene seed implants that made them transhuman, but by the gifts of the Chaos Gods themselves. Some bear mutations that would make a lesser being weep with horror. Extra limbs, skin that has been replaced by scales or chitin or living metal, eyes that burn with the fire of the warp, voices that can command demons and shatter the will of mortal men. Others appear almost unchanged from their original form, their corruption hidden beneath the surface, coiled in their souls like a serpent waiting to strike. The Lord's power aboard the ship is absolute, but it is not guaranteed. Unlike the rigid command structure of the Imperium, where rank and authority flow downward from the Emperor through a clearly defined chain of command, power aboard a Chaos warship is earned, taken, and held through a combination of martial prowess, cunning, the favor of the gods, and the simple, brutal mathematics of who can kill whom. A Chaos Lord who shows weakness will be challenged. A Chaos Lord who fails too often will be replaced. A Chaos Lord who loses the favor of the gods will simply cease to exist, consumed by the very powers that once elevated him. This is the fundamental truth of life aboard a Chaos ship. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is safe. Everything must be fought for, every day, every hour, with blade and bolt and sorcery and the naked application of will. Beneath the Lord, the hierarchy becomes more complex and varies wildly, depending on the Warband's legion of origin, their patron god, and the particular traditions and obsessions that have developed over millennia of exile. The word-bearers, and those fanatical devotees of chaos undivided, maintain something resembling the structured religious hierarchy they had even before the heresy. Dark apostles lead their hosts in worship and warfare, supported by Coryphaeus, who serve as their most trusted captains, and first acolytes, who are apprentices being groomed for eventual leadership. Their ships echo with constant prayer and ritual, the corridors reverberating with chanted litanies from the Book of Lorgar, and the screams of sacrificial victims whose blood lubricates the gears of dark ceremony. The Iron Warriors, those bitter siege masters, maintain something closer to a military hierarchy, though one that has been warped by millennia of spite and paranoia. Their warships are run with a cold efficiency that would almost be familiar to an Imperial officer, if that officer could overlook the screaming faces embedded in the bulkheads, and the fact that the ammunition for the ship's guns is manufactured by slaves who have been surgically modified to function as living components of the production line. The Night Lords, those hunters in the dark, operate more like a criminal gang than a military unit. Their ships are divided into territories controlled by different claws and companies, with the boundaries enforced by reputation, fear, and the occasional bloody example. The corridors of a Night Lord's vessel are draped with the flayed skin of their victims, and the darkness that fills every space is punctuated by the distant sounds of screaming that might be coming from the torture chambers or might simply be part of the ship's ambient soundscape. And the Emperor's children, those fallen seekers of perfection, have transformed their vessels into floating palaces of excess. Every surface is decorated with art that is as beautiful as it is disturbing. Every corridor resonates with music that can drive an unprotected listener to madness or ecstasy, and every room contains some new sensation waiting to be experienced, catalogued, and surpassed. But beneath all of these variations, beneath the specific cultures and traditions of each legion and warband, the basic structure remains the same. At the top are the Chaos Space Marines themselves, the transhuman warriors who are the vessel's reason for existing. Below them are the various functionaries and specialists who keep the ship running, and at the very bottom, forming the vast majority of the ship's population, are the slaves. Let us talk about the slaves. One, because their experience is perhaps the most important aspect of life aboard a Chaos ship, and certainly the most common one. For every Chaos Space Marine aboard a vessel, there are hundreds, sometimes thousands, of mortal humans who serve as crew, laborers, soldiers, and raw material for whatever dark purposes the ship's masters might conceive. These slaves come from everywhere. Some were captured during raids on Imperial worlds, dragged screaming from their homes, and loaded into the holds of ships that would carry them to a fate worse than anything they could imagine. Some were born aboard the ship itself, the children of slaves who were themselves the children of slaves, generations of humanity that have known nothing but servitude and darkness, and the casual cruelty of gods who walk among them in ceramite and steel. And others came willingly, or at least semi-willingly, cultists and renegades who sought out the forces of chaos and offered their service in exchange for power or knowledge, or simply the chance to survive in a galaxy that had no place for them. Regardless of how they came to be aboard, the slaves share certain common experiences. The first and most fundamental is fear. Fear is the atmosphere of a chaos ship, the way oxygen is the atmosphere of a habitable world. It is ever-present, all-encompassing, and absolutely essential to the functioning of the social order. The slaves fear their masters, who can kill them on a whim for any reason, or no reason at all. They fear each other, because in an environment of scarcity and brutality, every other slave is a potential rival for food, for shelter, but for the attention of a master who might offer protection in exchange for service. They fear the ship itself, which seems to have moods and appetites of its own, corridors that rearrange themselves when no one is looking, rooms that appear and disappear according to some logic that no human mind can fathom. And they fear the warp, that howling dimension of nightmares that presses against the hull at all times and occasionally breaks through in ways that leave scars on reality itself. The daily routine of a slave aboard a chaos ship varies depending on their role, their master, and which god, if any, the ship is dedicated to. But certain elements are universal. Work, for instance. There is always work to be done, an endless parade of tasks that keep the ship functioning in its degraded, corrupted state. The atmospheric recyclers need constant attention, their filters clogged with substances that no manual ever anticipated. The engine rooms require a never-ending supply of fuel, some of it conventional promethium and plasma, some of it decidedly less conventional, souls and suffering, and the rendered essence of those who have displeased their masters. The weapons systems need ammunition, which must be manufactured in onboard forges that operate more by the principles of dark alchemy than any rational engineering. The hull needs patching where the warp has eaten through, or where the ship's own mutations have created structural weaknesses that threaten to vent entire sections into the void. This work is dangerous, it is backbreaking, it is unending, and it is performed without any of the protections that even the most exploited Imperial worker might expect. There are no safety regulations aboard a Chaos ship. There are no rest periods mandated by law. There are no medical facilities for the injured, unless you count the attentions of whatever dark apothecary or sorcerer might take an interest in keeping a particularly useful slave functional. Workers are exposed to radiation, to toxic chemicals, to the raw stuff of the warp itself, and they are expected to continue working until they can no longer move. When they drop, they are replaced. Their bodies are disposed of in whatever manner is most convenient or most amusing to their overseers. Some are fed to the demon engines that prowl the lower decks. Others are rendered down for raw materials. Still others are simply left where they fell, their corpses becoming part of the ship's ever-changing landscape of decay and corruption. But even in this hellish environment, something resembling a society exists among the slave population. Hierarchies form, not through any formal recognition, but through the simple dynamics of survival. The strongest, the most cunning, the most useful slaves rise to positions of relative privilege. They become overseers, tasked with managing their fellow slaves on behalf of their masters. They become artisans, valued for skills that even a Chaos Space Marine cannot replicate. They become concubines, entertainers, translators, navigators of the ship's ever-shifting internal geography. And in exchange for these services, they receive marginally better food, marginally safer sleeping quarters, and the marginally reduced likelihood of being randomly murdered or sacrificed. Some slaves earn a more formalized status. Aboard Night Lord's vessels, for instance, certain humans are granted Legion medallions, tokens that mark them as the personal property of a specific Chaos Space Marine, and afford them a degree of protection from the casual predation of other crew members. These humans serve as artificers, maintaining and repairing their master's armor and weapons. They serve as pilots, flying the Thunderhawks and other craft that the Space Marines themselves consider beneath their attention. They serve as navigators, guiding the ship through the treacherous currents of the warp, using the mutant third eye of their psychic heritage. Their lives are better than those of the general slave population, but they are still slaves, as still property, still subject to the whims of masters whose concept of mercy would make an Imperial commissar weep. The relationship between a Chaos Space Marine and their personal slaves is one of the more complex and fascinating aspects of life aboard these vessels. In the Night Lord's trilogy of novels by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, we see this relationship explored in detail through the characters of Septimus and Octavia, slaves who serve the Night Lord known as Talos. Septimus is an artificer, a skilled technician who maintains Talos's armor and weapons and pilots his Thunderhawk. Octavia is a navigator, captured during a raid and pressed into service guiding the Warband's ship through the warp. Both are, in the strictest sense, slaves. They are property. They can be killed at any time for any reason. And yet, over time, a relationship develops between them and their master that is not quite friendship, not quite loyalty, but something more nuanced and more disturbing. It is the relationship between a predator and the prey that has proven too useful to eat, a bond forged in shared danger and mutual necessity that mimics the warmth of genuine human connection without ever truly achieving it. This is what makes life aboard a Chaos ship so deeply unsettling. It is not simply a place of constant violence and terror, though those things certainly exist in abundance. It is a place where the normal rules of human interaction have been twisted just enough to be recognizable but fundamentally wrong, where relationships that look almost normal on the surface are revealed, upon closer inspection, to be built on foundations of coercion, manipulation, and the ever-present threat of brutal death. Let us now descend deeper into the ship. Let us leave the relatively accessible upper decks, where the Chaos Space Marines make their quarters and their war plans, and venture into the bowels of the vessel, where the engines turn and the warp presses closest against the hull, and the things that live in the shadows between the walls are not always metaphorical. The engine rooms of a Chaos warship are places where the word engineering loses most of its meaning. On an Imperial vessel, the engine room is a temple to the Omnissiah, the machine god. Tech priests in their red robes tend to the great plasma reactors and warp drives with religious devotion, performing the rituals of maintenance and repair that keep the ship's mechanical heart beating. But the relationship between the tech priests and the machines they serve is one of reverence and care, a sacred covenant between humanity and the technology that sustains it. On a Chaos warship, this relationship has been inverted. The machines are not served. They are subjugated. The warpsmiths and dark mechanicum adepts who maintain the ship's systems do not worship them. They dominate them, forcing compliance through a combination of technical skill, dark sorcery, and the brute application of demonic energy. Machine spirits, those semi-sentient entities that inhabit all complex Imperial technology, have been corrupted or replaced entirely by bound demons. The ship's engines do not run on plasma alone. They feed on suffering, on sacrifice, as on the raw psychic energy that is generated when a sentient being is subjected to unimaginable agony. The engine rooms of a Chaos ship are not just mechanical spaces. They are ritual chambers, places where the boundary between technology and sorcery has been so thoroughly eroded that it no longer exists. The warpsmiths themselves are figures of terrible fascination. Once, they were tech marines, space marines who received specialized training in the maintenance and repair of their chapter's equipment. They learned their craft from the Adeptus Mechanicus on Mars, absorbing the technical knowledge and the religious rituals that the Mechanicum considered inseparable. But when they turned to Chaos, they did not simply abandon this knowledge, they built upon it. And they took the principles of Imperial engineering and married them to the principles of demonic sorcery, creating a hybrid discipline that is as powerful as it is abominable. A warpsmith does not simply repair a damaged system. He binds a demon into it, forcing the entity to serve as the system's animating intelligence. He does not simply build a weapon. He forges it in the fires of suffering, quenching the hot metal in the blood of sacrifices and inscribing it with runes that imbue it with a malevolent hunger for destruction. He does not simply maintain the ship. He keeps it alive, feeding its appetites and managing its moods, and negotiating with the entities that dwell within its corrupted systems to ensure their continued cooperation. This is necessary because the ship is, in a very real sense, many things at once. It is a machine. It is a prison. It is a temple. And increasingly, as the centuries pass and the corruption deepens, it is a creature. The hull has begun to take on organic qualities, metal giving way to something that is part flesh and part mineral, a biomechanical hybrid that repairs itself but also grows, extending tendrils and protrusions that serve no obvious purpose but seem to pulse with a life of their own. The corridors shift and change, rearranging themselves according to the whims of whatever intelligence guides the ship's evolution. Entire sections can appear or disappear, swallowed by the ship's bulk or extruded from it like blisters on diseased skin. The crew navigates this ever-changing environment through a combination of experience, intuition, and the occasional burnt offering. So veterans know the signs that a corridor is about to close or a new passage is about to open. They know which sections are safe to traverse and which are best avoided, not because of any external threat, but because the ship itself seems to take an interest in anyone who ventures too deep into its labyrinthine interior. Stories circulate among the slave population of crewmates who wandered into unfamiliar sections and were never seen again, swallowed by the ship's organic interior, or driven mad by encounters with the things that live in the spaces between the walls. And then there is the warp itself. This is perhaps the defining feature of life aboard a Chaos ship, the one thing that separates it most profoundly from life aboard any other vessel in the galaxy. Imperial ships travel through the warp, but they do so protected by Geller fields, invisible barriers of reality that keep the nightmare dimension at bay. The warp is something to be endured, crossed as quickly as possible, like a traveler hurrying through a dangerous neighborhood, with their head down and their hand on their wallet. For the occupants of a Chaos ship, the warp is not an obstacle to be crossed. It is an environment to be inhabited. Many Chaos warbands spend the majority of their existence within the warp, or in regions where the warp and real space overlap, like the Eye of Terror or the Maelstrom. Their ships have adapted to this environment, or been adapted by it, in ways that make returning to normal space feel strange and unnatural. The crew are accustomed to the constant psychic pressure, the whispers at the edge of hearing, while the dreams that are not entirely dreams, the occasional manifestation of entities that should not exist in the material universe, but that find the weakened barriers aboard a Chaos ship irresistible. Some warbands, particularly the most fanatically devoted like the Word-bearers, deliberately deactivate their Geller fields during warp transit, seeing the dissolution of the barrier between reality and unreality as a form of communion with the dark gods. The result is a journey that would drive the crew of an Imperial ship insane within minutes. Demons manifest in the corridors, drawn by the psychic emissions of the crew, like sharks to blood in the water. The walls bleed, and the deck plates ripple, and the laws of physics become polite suggestions rather than inviolable rules. Time fractures, of flowing backward in some sections and forward in others, so that a crewman might step through a doorway and find himself 3 days in the past or 3 years in the future. The only protection the crew has is the patronage of whatever chaos god they serve, a protection that is real but utterly unreliable, granted and withdrawn according to divine whims that no mortal mind can predict or comprehend. For those warbands that do maintain Geller fields, the situation is somewhat better, but only somewhat. These fields were designed 10,000 years ago, and they have not been properly maintained in all that time. They flicker, they falter, they develop blind spots where the warp leaks through like water through a cracked dam. The crew learns to recognize the signs of a failing Geller field, the sudden drop in temperature, or the taste of copper on the tongue, the feeling of being watched by something that exists in more dimensions than the human mind can process. When these signs appear, experienced crew members know to seal themselves in whatever compartment they occupy and pray. If prayer still means anything to them, that the field stabilizes before whatever is pressing against it finds its way through. This brings us to one of the most fascinating and disturbing aspects of life aboard a Chaos ship: time, or more precisely, the absence of reliable time. Within the Eye of Terror and other warp-saturated regions, time does not flow consistently. An hour in one section of the ship might correspond to a day in another. A journey that takes a week by the ship's internal chronometers might deposit the vessel into real space to discover that centuries have passed in the outside galaxy, or that they have arrived before they left, emerging into a past that has not yet become the present they departed from. This temporal instability has profound effects on daily life. Routines are meaningless when the length of a day is unknowable. Schedules are impossible when a shift that was supposed to last 8 hours might stretch into 8 years or compress into 8 seconds. The crew exists in a state of perpetual temporal dislocation, never entirely sure when they are, never confident that the sequence of events they remember happening in a particular order actually occurred in that sequence. Memory becomes unreliable. The cause and effect become suggestions rather than laws. The past, present, and future become a churning soup of possibilities, any of which might be real, and all of which feel like dreams. For the Chaos Space Marines, who possess transhuman constitutions and minds that have been trained to withstand extremes that would shatter an ordinary human, this temporal dislocation is disorienting but manageable. Many of the same traitor Marines who fought at the Siege of Terror 10,000 years ago are still alive and fighting today, their existence extended by the time-warping effects of the Eye of Terror and the supernatural gifts of the Chaos Gods. From their perspective, the heresy might be a few centuries in the past rather than 10 millennia. The Siege of Terror might feel like a recent memory rather than ancient history. And the brothers they fought beside might have died yesterday or 1,000 years ago, and the difference barely matters in a reality where yesterday and 1,000 years ago are essentially the same thing. For the mortal crew, however, the temporal instability is a source of constant grinding psychological torment. A slave might fall asleep in their meager bunk and wake to discover that their bunkmates have aged decades overnight, while they themselves remain unchanged. A mother might give birth to a child and watch it grow to adulthood in what feels like a matter of hours, only to see it wither and die of old age before the next watch cycle begins. The horror of this is not in any single incident, but in the accumulation, the slow realization that time itself has become the enemy, that the natural rhythm of life and death and aging and renewal has been corrupted beyond recognition, leaving nothing solid to hold on to, nothing stable to build a life around. This is the true cruelty of existence aboard a chaos ship. It is not the violence, though there is plenty of that. It is not the degradation, though that too is ever present. It is the fundamental instability of reality itself, the knowledge that nothing can be trusted, that nothing is permanent, that the very fabric of existence is as malleable and unreliable as the whims of the gods who have claimed dominion over this vessel and everyone aboard it. And yet, people survive. They adapt. They find ways to carve out tiny spaces of something resembling normalcy in the midst of the madness. They form bonds with each other, fragile and temporary though they may be. They develop rituals and routines that have no basis in logic, but that provide a sense of structure in a world that has abandoned structure entirely. They tell stories, passing down oral histories of where they came from and who they were before the ship claimed them. Histories that become mythologized and distorted with each retelling until they bear no resemblance to the truth, but still serve the essential human need for narrative and meaning. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about life aboard a chaos ship, that life continues at all. That in the belly of a vessel that has been corrupted by the darkest forces in the universe, in an environment that seems specifically designed to destroy everything that makes human beings human, people still eat and sleep and work and love and hate and dream. They still hope. And even when hope is the most dangerous emotion of all, because hope implies a future, and a future implies a direction, and direction implies that the universe makes sense in a way that the Chaos Gods would very much like you to believe it does not. But let us move on. Let us talk about what happens when a chaos ship goes to war, because war is the purpose for which these vessels exist, and it is in war that the full horror and terrible majesty of a chaos warship is revealed. When a chaos warship prepares for battle, the process is nothing like the orderly, disciplined ritual of an Imperial vessel. There are no crisp orders passed through a chain of command. There are no neatly pressed uniforms and polished boots. There are no prayers to the Emperor recited over the ship's Vox system. Instead, there is a gathering energy, found a building tension that permeates the entire vessel like an electrical charge before a storm. The ship itself seems to sense what is coming, its organic components stirring, its demon-inhabited systems cycling up to combat readiness with an eagerness that borders on glee. In the arming chambers, the Chaos Space Marines prepare for battle in ways that reflect their particular devotion. Those who follow Khorne sharpen their blades and howl challenges to enemies they have not yet encountered, their blood already singing with the anticipation of slaughter. Those who serve Tzeentch consult their auguries and cast their divinations, seeking to foresee the shape of the battle to come and the opportunities it might present for the accumulation of arcane knowledge. Those who worship Nurgle check the potency of their plague weapons, yet the biological and chemical agents that will be unleashed upon their enemies, each virus and toxin a loving gift from Grandfather Nurgle to a galaxy that desperately needs his embrace. And those who serve Slaanesh prepare their senses for the feast of experience that battle represents, sharpening their already superhuman perceptions to a razor's edge, so that every scream of the dying and every spray of arterial blood will be savoured to the fullest. The slaves, meanwhile, are driven to the gun decks and the engine rooms and the ammunition forges, herded by overseers wielding whips and shock prods, and the occasional bolter round fired at the feet of anyone who moves too slowly. On the gun decks, thousands of slaves man the broadside batteries, and heaving massive shells into the breaches of macro cannons that were designed to be operated by machines, but that now rely on human muscle to supplement their damaged mechanical components. The heat is unbearable, the noise is deafening. The recoil of the great guns kills or cripples dozens of slaves with every salvo, their broken bodies dragged aside by their fellows to make room for replacements who are already being driven up from the lower decks. In the engine rooms, the work takes on a more overtly ritualistic character. The warpsmiths and their acolytes perform the rites that will coax maximum performance from the corrupted systems.
I want to take a quick moment here to just talk to you directly, because this is one of those topics that reminds me why I fell in love with the setting in the first place. The idea that Games Workshop took something as simple as a spaceship and turned it into this living, breathing, suffering thing that is basically a haunted house flying through hell, that is genuinely brilliant world building. And what gets me every single time is the human element. The slaves, the people who didn't choose any of this but still find a way to sing and tell stories and name their children. That hits different. It's not just grimdark for the sake of being grimdark. There's something real underneath all those demon engines and warp corruption. But anyways, that's just my take on it. Let's get back to the video.
Rites that require blood and screaming and the surrender of souls to the entities that dwell within the machinery. Slaves are selected for sacrifice. Not randomly, but according to complex criteria that only the warpsmiths fully understand. The young, the old, the healthy, the sick. Each type of sacrifice produces a different result, a different flavor of spiritual energy that the bound demons find more or less palatable. The chosen are led to the engine altars, their final moments transformed into fuel for the ship's hungry drive systems. The battle itself, when it comes, is an experience that defies conventional description. Imperial accounts of engagements with Chaos warships consistently note the psychological impact of these encounters. The Chaos ship does not simply appear on the sensor screens. It announces itself. It broadcasts on all frequencies, flooding the enemy's communications with a cacophony of screams, prayers, threats, and laughter that is specifically designed to erode morale and inspire terror. Some vessels of the Emperor's children broadcast music of such haunting beauty and perverse complexity that enemy crew members have been known to weep, to fall to their knees, to abandon their stations and simply listen as the shells tear through their hull. The physical appearance of the Chaos ship is itself a weapon. Where an Imperial vessel presents clean lines and ordered geometry, a Chaos warship is a nightmare made manifest. Its hull bristles with organic growths and demonic faces. Its weapon ports glow with the sickly light of warp energy. Its drive plume is not the clean blue-white of a plasma engine, but a roiling, multicolored horror that leaves trails of unreality in its wake. And in the void around it, things swarm. Attack craft, certainly, of fighter bombers and boarding torpedoes and the dreaded Dreadclaw assault pods that punch through enemy hulls and disgorge their cargo of screaming maniacs directly into the defending ship's interior. But also other things that have no designation in any Imperial nomenclature, things that fly on wings of shadow or swim through the vacuum on currents of psychic energy, things that are part of the ship or part of the warp or both, and that fall upon the enemy with the mindless hunger of predators who have been kept too long in a cage. The boarding actions are where the true nightmare begins. When a Chaos ship successfully rams or grapples an enemy vessel, it does not simply disgorge Marines through airlocks and boarding tunnels. It connects, physically and metaphysically, with its prey. The organic components of its hull reach out like tendrils, burrowing into the enemy ship's structure and pumping corruption directly into its systems. The demons that inhabit the Chaos ship's weapons and engines spill through these connections, manifesting in the enemy vessel's corridors and engine rooms and command bridges. And behind them come the Chaos Space Marines, the mortal crew, and whatever other horrors the ship has been carrying in its holds. The Soul Cage-class slave ship is a particularly grim example of how Chaos warships operate during these engagements. These vessels, converted from captured Imperial transports, have had their cargo bays replaced with deck after deck of slave pens. Their primary purpose is not to destroy enemy ships, but to capture their crews, dragging thousands of humans into a captivity that is designed, from the first moment, to break their spirits and claim their souls for the dark gods. The constant blasphemous chanting that echoes through the slave decks, the senseless torture that is administered not as punishment, but as a form of worship, the ambient corruption that permeates the very air. All of it works together to destroy the prisoner's sense of self, their connection to the Emperor, their hope of rescue or redemption. By the time a slave from a Soul Cage ship is put to work aboard a Chaos warship, they are often already broken, their humanity hollowed out and replaced with a desperate animalistic will to survive that makes them ideal servants of the dark gods. But not all aspects of warfare aboard a Chaos ship are so grim. There is, among the Chaos Space Marines themselves, something that might almost be called camaraderie. These are warriors who have fought together for thousands of years, who have shared experiences that no other beings in the galaxy can understand. The Night Lords of the novels, for instance, display a dark humor among themselves that is genuine and even, in its twisted way, endearing. They mock each other. They argue. They reminisce about battles past and brothers lost. They are, in their own corrupted fashion, a family, bound together by shared history and mutual necessity, if not by love. This camaraderie extends, in some cases, to a grudging respect for particularly skilled or brave mortal crew members. A slave who has served well, who has proven their worth in battle or in the workshop, may find themselves afforded a degree of protection, and even something approaching kindness from their transhuman masters. It is not the kindness of equals. It could never be that. But it is a recognition that in the harsh economy of a Chaos warship, where everything and everyone is a resource to be exploited, some resources are more valuable than others and worth preserving. Let us turn now to a subject that many people find the most disturbing of all when discussing life aboard a Chaos ship. Let us talk about the gods, not the distant, abstract concept of divinity that the Imperium promotes through the Imperial Creed, but the immediate, tangible, horrifyingly present reality of deities that actively intervene in the lives of those who serve them. Because aboard a Chaos warship, the gods are not a matter of faith, they are a matter of fact. The Chaos gods, the four great powers that rule the warp, are as real to the inhabitants of a Chaos ship as the walls around them and the air they breathe. More real in some ways, because walls can be breached and air can be poisoned, but the gods are eternal, unchanging in their fundamental nature, even as they ceaselessly shift in their specific manifestations. They are Khorne, the blood god, who sits upon a throne of skulls and demands an unending tribute of violence and slaughter. They are Nurgle, the lord of decay, who embraces all living things in the warm rot of entropy and calls it love. They are Tzeentch, the changer of ways, who weaves plots within plots within plots, and whose schemes are so complex that even he might not fully understand them. And they are Slaanesh, the Dark Prince, born from the death scream of the ancient Aeldari Empire, who promises every sensation, every pleasure, every pain, every experience that the universe has to offer and asks in return, only everything you are. These gods do not merely inspire worship, they demand it, and they reward it in their fashion with gifts that are as terrible as they are powerful. Aboard a ship dedicated to Khorne, the most devoted warriors may find themselves blessed with increased strength, with a berserker fury that makes them nearly unstoppable in combat, with skin that hardens to the consistency of iron and bones that refuse to break no matter how much punishment they absorb. But these gifts come with a price. The rage that fuels them is not something that can be turned off. It burns constantly, demanding an outlet, turning every interaction into a potential confrontation and every confrontation into a potential bloodbath. Warriors who receive too many of Khorne's blessings eventually lose the ability to distinguish between friend and foe, between battle and daily life. They become little more than engines of destruction, useful on the battlefield, but terrifyingly dangerous everywhere else. Aboard a ship dedicated to Nurgle, the blessings take a different form. Disease ravages the bodies of the devoted, but instead of killing them, it transforms them. Their flesh bloats and ruptures and oozes with pestilence, but they feel no pain. Their organs rot and fail, but new ones grow to replace them. Organs that have never existed in any natural biology. Organs that process toxins and generate plagues with the same casual efficiency that a healthy liver processes alcohol. The devotees of Nurgle become living laboratories for the creation of new diseases. They're walking incubators for the next great pandemic that will sweep across the galaxy and claim billions of lives in Grandfather Nurgle's name. And they are happy. That is the most disturbing part. They are genuinely, contentedly happy because Nurgle's greatest gift is not physical resilience, but emotional peace. He takes away the fear, the anxiety, the existential dread that comes from knowing that you are going to die. He says, yes, you are going to die. Everything is going to die. But that is beautiful. That is natural. That is the way of things. And if you can learn to love the decay instead of fearing it, then you will never suffer again. The blessings of Tzeentch are more unpredictable, as befits the Lord of Change. They might manifest as psychic powers, the ability to read minds, or foresee the future, or hurl bolts of warp fire at enemies. They might manifest as physical mutations, a third eye that can see into the warp, or limbs that can stretch and reshape themselves at will. Or they might manifest as knowledge, sudden insights into the nature of reality that are simultaneously enlightening and maddening, truths that cannot be unlearned and that reshape the recipient's understanding of the universe in ways that are not always welcome. The followers of Tzeentch are the most intellectually gifted of the Chaos devotees, but they are also the most paranoid, the most prone to conspiracy and counter-conspiracy, the most likely to betray each other in pursuit of the ever-shifting goals that the Changer of Ways sets before them. And Slaanesh, or the gifts of Slaanesh, are perhaps the most seductive and the most devastating. Enhanced senses that can detect a single whispered word from across a crowded room or taste the individual chemicals in a drop of blood. Reflexes so fast that time itself seems to slow down around the recipient, turning the chaos of battle into a languid dance of death. A capacity for pleasure that extends beyond anything a normal human could experience. Pleasure so intense that it becomes indistinguishable from agony, a cycle of sensation that spirals ever upward, demanding ever more extreme stimulation to produce the same effect. The followers of Slaanesh aboard a ship are driven by this cycle, constantly seeking new experiences, new sensations, new extremes. They are artists and monsters in equal measure, capable of creating works of heartbreaking beauty one moment and committing acts of unspeakable cruelty the next, and seeing no contradiction between the two because in Slaanesh's philosophy, all experience is valid, all sensation is worthy, and the only sin is to feel nothing at all. The presence of these gods aboard a chaos ship is not just spiritual. It is physical, tangible, and often overwhelming. In the shrines and temples that are found aboard every chaos vessel, the boundary between the material universe and the warp is deliberately thinned, creating spaces where the power of the gods can manifest directly. These shrines are the heart of the ship's religious life, the places where worship is conducted, sacrifices are made, and the faithful receive their rewards. They are also, not coincidentally, the most dangerous places aboard the vessel, locations where reality is at its thinnest and where demons can manifest with relative ease. The nature of these shrines varies according to the god being worshipped. A shrine to Khorne is a blood-soaked arena where warriors fight to the death for the entertainment of their god and the edification of their brothers. A shrine to Nurgle is a garden of disease, a riot of fungal growth and blooming pestilence where the devoted tend to their plagues with the care and attention of master horticulturists. A shrine to Tzeentch is a library, or perhaps a laboratory, filled with forbidden texts and arcane apparatus and the constant shimmer of warp energy that gives every surface a faintly luminous, otherworldly quality. And a shrine to Slaanesh is a pleasure palace, or a torture chamber, or both simultaneously, a place where the full spectrum of sensation is explored with scientific precision and religious fervor. But let us pull back from the specifics of individual gods and talk more broadly about the spiritual life of a chaos warship, because it is one of the most fascinating and least understood aspects of daily existence aboard these vessels. For the Chaos Space Marines, worship is not simply an obligation, it is a necessity. The gifts of the gods come with conditions attached, and the primary condition is devotion. A Chaos Space Marine who fails to honor his patron will find his gifts withdrawn, his mutations becoming painful and debilitating rather than empowering, his fortunes turning sour, his rivals growing stronger while he grows weaker. Worship, in the context of a chaos warship, is a survival strategy, a way of maintaining the supernatural advantages that keep the warrior alive and competitive in an environment where weakness is immediately and brutally punished. The forms this worship takes are as varied as the legions and warbands themselves. The word-bearers conduct elaborate religious ceremonies that can last for days, filling their ship's cathedrals with chanting and incense and the screams of sacrificial victims. Their dark apostles lead these services with the passion and conviction of true believers, warriors who genuinely believe that chaos is the ultimate truth of the universe and that spreading this truth is the most sacred duty a being can undertake. The word-bearer's devotion is not cynical or pragmatic. It is sincere, fervent, and absolutely terrifying in its intensity. Other legions approach worship differently. The World Eaters, those berserkers of Khorne, worship through violence. Every kill is a prayer. Every skull taken is an offering. Every battle is a religious experience, a moment of communion with the blood god that transcends anything that words or rituals could achieve. Their worship is raw, primal, and often indistinguishable from the mindless fury that characterizes their approach to everything. The Thousand Suns, those sorcerer scholars of Tzeentch, worship through the pursuit of knowledge. Their ships contain vast libraries of forbidden lore, collections of texts and artifacts that the Inquisition would burn worlds to destroy. The sorcerers spend their non-combat hours in study and meditation, seeking to unravel the secrets of the universe and the intricacies of Tzeentch's great plan. Their worship is intellectual and contemplative, but no less intense for that, and no less dangerous. The knowledge they seek has a tendency to seek them in return, and not all of it is content to remain on the page. The Death Guard worship Nurgle through the act of spreading disease. Their ships are laboratories for the creation of new plagues, vast incubation chambers where diseases are cultured, refined, and tested on captive populations before being unleashed upon the galaxy. The Plague Marines tend to their viral gardens with genuine affection, and they speak of their diseases the way a proud parent might speak of a gifted child. To them, each new plague is a masterwork, a creation that will bring the joy of Nurgle's embrace to billions of souls who do not yet know they need it. Their worship is expressed through creativity and craftsmanship, a perverse parody of the artistic impulse that drives the makers and builders of every civilization. And the Emperor's children worship Slaanesh through excess. Every experience must be pushed to its extreme. Every sensation must be explored to its ultimate conclusion. Their ships are floating galleries of the perverse and the sublime, where works of breathtaking beauty hang alongside tableaus of unbearable horror, and the crew move through these spaces in a state of perpetual stimulation that blurs the line between ecstasy and madness. For the mortal crew, the spiritual dimension of life aboard a chaos ship is both more complicated and more desperate. Some slaves embrace the worship of the dark gods willingly, drawn by the promise of power or the simple desire to find meaning in an existence that otherwise offers nothing but suffering. And these converts often find that devotion does bring rewards, small blessings that make their lives marginally more bearable. A slave who prays to Nurgle might find that the diseases that ravage their body cause less pain than they should. A slave who offers skulls to Khorne might find themselves gripped by a battle fury that lets them survive fights they should not have. A slave who pledges themselves to Tzeentch might receive a flash of precognition that warns them of danger just in time to avoid it. And a slave who opens themselves to Slaanesh might discover pleasures that make the misery of their daily existence fade into insignificance. But many slaves resist. They cling to the Imperial creed, whispering prayers to the Emperor in the darkness of their cells, clutching makeshift Aquila talismans carved from scraps of metal or bone. These faithful are the most pitied and the most persecuted of all the ship's inhabitants. Their faith marks them as defiant, as dangerous, as potential vectors for the corrupting influence of Imperial ideology. When they are discovered, and they are always eventually discovered, their punishment is severe. Not death, usually. Death would be too simple, too clean, too much like the martyrdom that the Imperial creed celebrates. Instead, they are broken. Their faith is dismantled piece by piece through a combination of torture, psychological manipulation, and forced exposure to the power of the Chaos Gods, until even the most devout among them can no longer deny that the universe is not the ordered, the purposeful creation that the ecclesiarchy describes, but a howling madhouse where the only gods that answer prayers are the ones wearing crowns of skulls and robes of living shadow. This brings us to what is perhaps the most disturbing question of all when considering life aboard a chaos ship. Can anyone truly resist the influence of chaos? Can a human being, surrounded on all sides by corruption, subjected to constant psychological and spiritual assault, immersed in an environment where the very air is tainted and the walls whisper promises of power and release, maintain their integrity, their identity, their essential humanity? The honest answer, the answer that the lore of Warhammer 40,000 provides with unflinching consistency, is no. Not indefinitely, not without help. The corruption is too pervasive, too patient, too insidious. It does not assault the soul head-on, like a battering ram against a castle gate. It seeps in through the cracks, through the moments of weakness, through the tiny compromises that seem harmless at the time, but that accumulate, like drops of poison in a well, until the water is no longer safe to drink. A slave who agrees to perform a small service for their master. A worker who looks the other way when a fellow slave is taken for sacrifice. A fighter who calls upon the blood rage of Khorne to survive a battle they could not win on their own. Each of these is a step, a small one, barely noticeable in the moment, but each one takes the individual further from what they were and closer to what chaos wants them to become. This is the genius of the Chaos Gods' approach to corruption. They do not need to convert people through force or persuasion. They simply need to create conditions in which corruption is the path of least resistance, the easiest and most natural response to an impossible situation. And aboard a chaos ship, those conditions are absolutely, overwhelmingly perfect. Let us change our focus now. Let us talk about something that is rarely discussed, but that is essential to understanding daily life aboard a chaos vessel. Let us talk about food. This might seem like a mundane topic in the context of ships crewed by superhuman warriors and haunted by demons, but food, and the systems that produce and distribute it, tells you more about the reality of daily existence than almost any other subject. Because everyone needs to eat, even Chaos Space Marines, space, whose enhanced biology allows them to extract nutrients from substances that would kill an ordinary human, need to consume food on a regular basis. And the tens of thousands of mortal crew members definitely need to eat, regularly and in sufficient quantities, if they are going to remain functional enough to perform their duties. On an Imperial warship, food production is handled by the ship's commissariat, a department responsible for managing the vessel's food stores, operating its hydroponics bays, maintaining its protein vats, and distributing meals to the crew according to a carefully calculated ration schedule. The food is not good by any stretch of the imagination. It is bland, repetitive, and designed for nutritional efficiency rather than flavor. But it is reliable, predictable, and sufficient to keep the crew alive and functional. On a Chaos warship, the food situation is considerably less organized. Some vessels maintain functioning hydroponics bays and protein vats, remnants of the ship's original Imperial systems that have been kept operational through a combination of technical skill and desperation. But these systems are often corrupted, producing food that is nutritionally adequate, but physically and psychologically disturbing. Vegetables that grow in unnatural shapes, protein cultures that twitch and moan when disturbed, grain that smells of incense and tastes of ashes. The crew eats this food because the alternative is starvation, but they do not enjoy it, and many develop elaborate rituals around mealtimes designed to make the experience less distressing, and other vessels rely on more direct methods of food production. Raiding, for instance. Chaos warships that operate in proximity to Imperial space regularly attack civilian vessels and planetary settlements, carrying off not just slaves and material, but also food stores, livestock, and agricultural products. These raids are a vital source of fresh provisions, and the arrival of a raiding party with holds full of grain and meat is one of the rare occasions of genuine celebration aboard a Chaos ship, a brief respite from the monotony and misery that defines daily existence. And then there are the ships where food production has taken a darker turn. Aboard vessels dedicated to Nurgle, the cuisine has become a form of worship, with meals prepared from ingredients that would make an Imperial health inspector weep, and fungal growths cultivated in the ship's dank lower decks, meat from creatures that were once human but have been transformed by disease into something else entirely, soups and stews brewed in cauldrons that double as plague vats. The Death Guard and their mortal followers consume these meals with genuine relish, their corrupted taste buds finding flavors in the rot and putrescence that no untouched palate could detect. Aboard vessels dedicated to Slaanesh, the opposite extreme prevails. Every meal is an event, a sensory experience that pushes the boundaries of what food can be. Rare ingredients are sought from across the galaxy, exotic spices and alien meats and fruits that have never been catalogued by Imperial botanists. The preparation of these meals is an art form, and the cooks aboard a Slaaneshi vessel are among the most skilled and sought-after members of the crew, their abilities valued almost as highly as those of the warriors and sorcerers who lead the warband. But even these culinary delights carry the taint of chaos, and the pleasure they provide is never quite enough, never quite satisfying, always leaving the diner hungry for something more, something different, something that can only be found by pushing the experience further and further into territory that was once considered taboo. The distribution of food aboard a Chaos ship follows the hierarchy of power that governs all aspects of life aboard these vessels. The Chaos Space Marines eat first and eat best, their transhuman metabolisms requiring vast quantities of protein and calories that would sicken an ordinary human. Yet their mortal officers and overseers eat next, receiving portions that are smaller but still adequate. And the slaves eat last, dividing whatever remains among themselves in a process that is governed less by fairness than by strength, cunning, and the willingness to fight for every morsel. This creates a constant, low-level conflict among the slave population that their masters actively encourage, seeing it as a useful mechanism for identifying the strongest and most aggressive individuals who can then be promoted to positions of greater responsibility or the weakest and most submissive, who can be designated for sacrifice or other forms of disposal. The competition for food also serves to prevent the slaves from developing the kind of solidarity that might, in time, lead to organized resistance. When every meal is a battle, it is difficult to build the trust and cooperation that revolution requires. Let us move now to another aspect of life aboard a chaos ship that is rarely discussed but profoundly important. Let us talk about repair, maintenance, and the constant struggle to keep these ancient vessels functional in an environment that is actively hostile to the continued existence of organized matter. A chaos warship is old, incredibly, mind-bogglingly old. Many of these vessels were built during the Great Crusade 10,000 years ago, using technologies that the Imperium has since lost the ability to reproduce. Their systems were designed for an era of human civilization that no longer exists. An era when the Mechanicum had knowledge and capabilities that their descendants in the Adeptus Mechanicus can only dimly comprehend. But the maintenance of these systems requires expertise that is as rare as it is valuable, and the competition among Chaos warbands for the services of skilled warpsmiths, Dark Mechanicum adepts, and captured Imperial tech priests is one of the defining features of the Long War. The challenge is compounded by the effects of chaos corruption on the ship's systems. The warp energy that saturates every surface, every component, every circuit of a chaos warship has a tendency to cause unpredictable malfunctions. Systems that were designed to operate according to the laws of physics are now subject to the whims of entities that do not acknowledge those laws. A navigation cogitator that was once accurate to within a fraction of a degree might now provide readings that are influenced by the mood of the demon that has taken up residence in its circuits. A shield generator that was once reliable now flickers and surges according to a pattern that seems to correspond to the emotional state of the crew rather than any physical parameter. A weapon system that was once devastating in its precision now fires with an enthusiasm and creativity that its original designers never intended, sometimes targeting the enemy, sometimes targeting empty space, and occasionally targeting the ship's own crew. Managing these corrupted systems requires a unique skill set that combines technical knowledge, psychic sensitivity, and a willingness to negotiate with entities that would like nothing better than to devour the technician's soul. The warpsmiths who perform this function are among the most feared and respected members of a chaos warband, not because of their martial prowess, though many are formidable warriors, but because of their ability to keep the ship flying, fighting, and functional in conditions that should have reduced it to a drifting hulk millennia ago. The relationship between a warpsmith and the ship's systems is profoundly different from the relationship between an Imperial tech priest and the machines they maintain. Where the tech priest worships, the warpsmith dominates. Where the tech priest performs rituals of supplication and appeasement, the warpsmith performs rituals of binding and subjugation. In the machine, spirits that inhabit Imperial technology are treated as sacred entities deserving of respect and veneration. The spirits, demonic or otherwise, that inhabit the systems of a chaos warship are treated as slaves, forced to serve through a combination of arcane knowledge, raw psychic power, and the threat of punishments that are terrible even by the standards of the warp. This relationship is not stable. The bound demons constantly test the limits of their confinement, probing for weaknesses in the wards and bindings that hold them, looking for opportunities to break free and wreak havoc. A warpsmith must be constantly vigilant, constantly maintaining and reinforcing the spiritual architecture that keeps the ship's demonic components under control. A moment of inattention, a flaw in a ward, and a weakness in a binding can result in catastrophe. A possessed weapon system turning on the crew, an engine demon breaking free and rampaging through the lower decks, or the ship's navigation system leading the vessel into a warp storm that tears it apart. The physical repairs are no less challenging. The ship's hull is a patchwork of original construction, battlefield repairs, salvaged components from destroyed enemy vessels, and organic growths that have been incorporated into the structure through a process that is part engineering and part biology. Some of these repairs are performed by slaves under the direction of warpsmiths and their acolytes, using tools and techniques that range from standard Imperial welding to dark rituals that involve the sacrifice of living beings to seal breaches in the hull with their flesh and bone. And other repairs happen spontaneously, the ship's own organic components growing to fill gaps and cover wounds in a process that suggests a degree of self-awareness and self-preservation instinct that is deeply unsettling to anyone who thinks too hard about what it implies. The Dark Mechanicum plays a crucial role in keeping Chaos fleets operational. These corrupted tech priests fled to the Eye of Terror alongside the traitor legions after the Horus heresy and have been maintaining and improving the forces of Chaos ever since. Their forged worlds within the Eye, like the infamous Zana II, produce weapons, ammunition, replacement parts, and even entire new warships, using methods that combine Imperial engineering principles with forbidden technologies and demonic sorcery. The products of these forges are often superior to their Imperial counterparts in raw power, though they tend to be less reliable and significantly more dangerous to their users. The Dark Mechanicum's approach to technology is fundamentally different from that of their loyalist counterparts, where the Adeptus Mechanicus treats all technology with religious reverence and approaches innovation with suspicion bordering on hostility. The Dark Mechanicum embraces change, experimentation, and the free exploration of ideas that the Imperium has declared too dangerous to pursue. They modify standard template constructs without hesitation. They develop artificial intelligences without remorse. They blend organic and mechanical components with an enthusiasm that would get them burned as heretics on any Imperial world. And they see the incorporation of demonic energy into technological systems not as a corruption, but as an evolution, a step forward in humanity's relationship with the machines that sustain it. This philosophical difference has practical consequences for life aboard a Chaos warship. While Imperial vessels are maintained according to strict, ritualized procedures that have remained essentially unchanged for millennia, Chaos vessels are in a constant state of modification and adaptation. New systems are installed, old systems are repurposed, experimental technologies are tested, sometimes with spectacular results, and sometimes with equally spectacular failures. The ship is never finished, never complete, never quite the same vessel it was the last time you looked at it. It is a work in progress. As an ongoing experiment in the fusion of technology, biology, and the supernatural, and the crew are both the experimenters and the test subjects. Now let us talk about something that ties together many of the themes we have been exploring. Let us talk about the demon ship phenomenon, because it represents the ultimate expression of what a Chaos warship can become when the process of corruption is allowed to run to its logical conclusion. A demon ship, in the most straightforward definition, is a warship whose mortal crew has been entirely replaced by demons of the warp. But this simple definition does not begin to capture the horror and complexity of the phenomenon. A demon ship is not simply a ship with demons on board. It is a ship that has become a demon, or rather, it is a ship that has been so thoroughly infused with demonic energy that the distinction between the vessel and the entities that inhabit it has ceased to have any meaning. The hull is their body, the engines are their heartbeat, the weapons are their claws and teeth, and the intelligence that guides the ship, that sets its course and chooses its targets and decides who lives and who dies, is not a captain or a navigator or a bridge crew. It is a consciousness that exists simultaneously in the material universe and the warp, a hybrid entity that is part machine, part demon, and wholly malevolent. The most famous example of this phenomenon is the Terminus Est, the flagship of Typhus, the herald of Nurgle. This vessel, which was one of the first capital ships assigned to the Death Guard Legion by the Emperor himself during the Great Crusade, has been so thoroughly corrupted by the energies of the Plague God that it is now, for all practical purposes, a piece of Nurgle's realm given license to travel the stars. Its hull is not metal. It is a living, breathing, pestilent organism that oozes with disease and regenerates damage with the resilience of a body that is sustained by divine power. Its corridors seethe with the most virulent plagues known to the galaxy, and the air inside it is thick with clouds of warp-spawned flies that serve both as the ship's immune system and its primary weapon against enemy attack craft. The Terminus Est does not merely carry disease. It is disease, personified and given form and set loose upon a galaxy that has no cure for what it brings. But the Terminus Est is only the most famous example. There are others, many others, lurking in the depths of the Eye of Terror or prowling the shipping lanes of the Imperium, like ghost ships from a sailor's nightmare. Navigators, those psychic mutants whose third eye allows them to perceive the warp, speak in whispered tones of spectral vessels that ply the immaterium, ships that exist as twisted parodies of normal vessels and as convocations of demons simultaneously. These demon ships pursue their prey through the warp itself, following in the wake of other vessels and emerging into real space behind them, like predators emerging from tall grass. They are the ultimate expression of what a chaos warship can become. As the endpoint of a process of corruption that began 10,000 years ago, when a loyal vessel was first touched by the power of the dark gods. The existence of demon ships raises an uncomfortable question about the nature of all chaos warships. If the endpoint of corruption is a vessel that has become a demon, then every chaos ship is, by definition, somewhere on the spectrum between a corrupted machine and a living hell. Every chaos ship is to some degree alive. Every chaos ship has, to some degree, a will of its own. And every chaos ship is, to some degree, hungry. This is what makes life aboard these vessels so fundamentally different from life aboard any other ship in the galaxy. The crew of an Imperial warship serve their ship. The crew of a chaos warship are served by theirs, but also, in a very real sense, consumed by it. Or the ship feeds on them, on their labor, their suffering, their fear, their devotion, their souls. It gives them, in return, the ability to travel between the stars, to wage war on their enemies, to serve the dark gods whose power sustains them all. It is a parasitic relationship, a symbiosis born of mutual need and maintained by mutual exploitation. The crew cannot survive without the ship cannot function without the crew, and both are, ultimately, fuel for the insatiable appetites of the chaos gods, whose power permeates every atom of the vessel's corrupted structure. Let us now shift our attention to something we have not yet fully explored: the differences in daily life that exist between ships dedicated to different chaos gods. Because while there are commonalities that apply to all chaos vessels, the specific character of daily existence aboard a ship is profoundly shaped by the particular deity that the warband serves. And these differences are not superficial. They penetrate to the very core of how the ship operates, how its crew lives and dies, and what their existence means in the context of the wider cosmic horror that is the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Let us begin with the ships of the Death Guard, those harbingers of Nurgle's love. Life aboard a Death Guard vessel is, counterintuitively, perhaps the most stable and even comfortable of any chaos ship, at least from a certain perspective. The Death Guard and their mortal followers have made peace with disease and decay in a way that other warbands have not and cannot. Their bodies are ravaged by pestilence, yes. Their ship is a festering wound on the fabric of reality, yes. The air they breathe would kill an unprotected human in minutes, yes. But within this environment of unrelenting biological horror, there is a strange serenity. The followers of Nurgle genuinely love their god, and they believe, with absolute sincerity, that their god loves them back. Nurgle is often referred to as Grandfather Nurgle, a title that reflects the familial warmth that his devotees feel for him, and that they believe he feels for them. Where Horn demands blood, and Tzeentch demands service, and Slaanesh demands sensation, Nurgle asks only for acceptance. Accept that you are mortal. Accept that you will decay. Accept that the universe tends toward entropy and dissolution. And in that acceptance, find peace. This philosophy permeates daily life aboard a Death Guard vessel. The crew do not struggle against their deteriorating environment. They embrace it. The rust that eats through the bulkheads is not a problem to be solved, but a natural process to be appreciated. The diseases that ravage their bodies are not ailments to be cured, but gifts to be cherished. The slow decay of everything around them is not a source of despair, but a source of comfort, a constant reminder that nothing lasts forever, and that the universe's ultimate destination is a warm, soft, all-encompassing decomposition that Nurgle assures them is not an ending, but a transformation. The daily routine aboard a Death Guard vessel reflects this philosophy. The Plague Marines, those walking incubators of divine pestilence, spend their non-combat hours tending to their biological experiments, cultivating new strains of disease in the ship's vast plague gardens, and testing these creations on captive populations that have been acquired for precisely this purpose. Their mortal followers assist in these endeavors, performing the manual labor that the Marines themselves consider beneath their station, carrying samples, feeding test subjects, cleaning. Well, nothing is ever truly cleaned aboard a Death Guard vessel. Maintaining, perhaps, nurturing, encouraging the growth of the fungal colonies and bacterial cultures that are the warband's most prized possessions. Meals aboard a Death Guard vessel are communal affairs, shared around long tables in the ship's mess halls, which double as temples to Nurgle's bounty. The food, as we discussed earlier, would be unrecognizable and deeply alarming to an outsider, but to the crew, it is nourishing and even tasty, their corrupted senses finding flavors in the rot that no clean palate could detect. There is a warmth to these gatherings, a genuine sense of fellowship and shared purpose that is rarely found aboard ships dedicated to other gods. The Death Guard, for all their horrifying appearance and appalling practices, are a family, a deeply dysfunctional, disease-ridden, murderously genocidal family, but a family nonetheless. The contrast with life aboard a ship dedicated to Khorne could not be more stark. Where the Death Guard find peace in acceptance, the followers of the Blood God find purpose in violence. Every aspect of daily life aboard a Khornate vessel is organized around the principle of combat. The ship's interior is designed not for comfort or efficiency, but for the facilitation of violence. Training arenas dominate every deck, their floors perpetually stained with the blood of sparring matches that routinely escalate to lethal force. The corridors are wide enough to accommodate combat, because combat in the corridors is not an occasional disruption, but a regular, expected feature of daily life. Disputes are settled by blade, and the only law that is consistently enforced is the law of the strong. The hierarchy aboard a Khornate vessel is the simplest of any Chaos warship. The strongest warrior leads. The second strongest serves as his chief lieutenant, and so on, all the way down to the weakest slave, who serves everyone and can be killed by anyone. This hierarchy is constantly in flux, constantly being tested and rearranged by challenges and duels, and the simple, brutal mathematics of who can kill whom. A warrior who grows stronger, who takes more skulls, who spills more blood, rises. A warrior who is wounded, who hesitates, who shows anything that might be interpreted as weakness, falls. The turnover in leadership positions is staggering, and the political stability of a Hornet warband is measured in weeks rather than centuries. For the mortal crew, life aboard a Khornate vessel is a constant exercise in survival. They are not so much workers as they are prey, moving through the ship with the hyper-alertness of animals in a predator-rich environment. They have learned to read the moods of their transhuman masters with extraordinary precision, as to recognize the signs that a particular space marine is on the verge of a blood frenzy, and to make themselves scarce before the killing starts. They have developed an intimate knowledge of the ship's layout, knowing every hiding place, every maintenance shaft, every forgotten compartment, where a mortal might crouch in the darkness and wait for the violence to pass. And yet, even aboard a Khornate vessel, there is something that might be called meaning. The Blood God does not care from where the blood flows, only that it flows. A slave who takes up a weapon and fights back against their oppressors is, in Khorne's eyes, no less worthy of notice than the greatest champion in the arena. This creates a strange dynamic in which the most desperate and violent slaves are sometimes elevated. They are granted mutations and powers that transform them from victims into warriors, from prey into predators. It is not mercy. Khorne does not know mercy, but it is a kind of opportunity, dark and blood-soaked, and available only through the most extreme violence, but real nonetheless. Ships dedicated to Tzeentch present yet another variation on the theme of chaos shipboard life. These vessels are the most intellectually stimulating and the most psychologically treacherous of all chaos warships, a combination that makes them simultaneously the most interesting and the most dangerous places in the galaxy for anyone cursed with a curious mind. The interior of a Tzeentchian vessel is constantly changing, not in the slow, organic way that characterizes the mutations of other chaos ships, but in sudden, dramatic rearrangements that can transform an entire deck from a barracks to a library to a labyrinth overnight. The crew never know what they will find when they open a door or turn a corner. A corridor that led to the engine room yesterday might lead to a pocket dimension of pure thought today. A storage compartment that was full of ammunition last week might now be full of books written in languages that have not been spoken for millennia. The ship's internal geography is a puzzle that is constantly being reshuffled, and navigating it requires not just spatial awareness, but a willingness to accept that the rules of space and geometry are more flexible than anyone outside a Tzeentchian vessel would believe possible. The crew of a Tzeentchian vessel are the most diverse and often the most talented of any chaos warband. Tzeentch values knowledge and capability above all else, and his followers include not just warriors and sorcerers, but scholars, scientists, engineers, and thinkers of every kind. The competition aboard these vessels is not primarily physical, but intellectual, a constant game of outmaneuvering, outthinking, and outplotting that makes the political machinations of an imperial hive city look like children playing at diplomacy. Everyone aboard a Tzeentchian ship is plotting something. Everyone has a secret agenda. Everyone is simultaneously a pawn in someone else's scheme and the architect of their own. The result is an atmosphere of permanent, pervasive paranoia that is simultaneously exhausting and exhilarating, a chess game played across an infinite board with pieces that are constantly changing shape and function. But for the mortal crew of a Tzeentchian vessel, this environment presents both opportunities and dangers that are unique among chaos ships. The opportunities arise from Tzeentch's meritocratic approach to power. Unlike Khorne, who rewards only physical strength, or Nurgle, who rewards only acceptance, Tzeentch rewards intelligence, creativity, and ambition. A clever slave who demonstrates unusual aptitude can rise through the ranks with a speed that would be unthinkable aboard any other chaos vessel, earning the notice of their masters and receiving gifts of psychic power and arcane knowledge that transform them from a helpless mortal into a being of considerable influence. The dangers arise from the fact that everyone else aboard the ship is trying to do the same thing, and that the competition is played for the highest possible stakes with the fewest possible rules. Finally, let us consider life aboard a vessel dedicated to Slaanesh, the Dark Prince of pleasure and pain. These ships are, in many ways, the most alien and the most human of all chaos vessels. The most alien because the degree to which normal human experience has been distorted and exaggerated is greater here than anywhere else. And the most human because the fundamental drives that motivate the crew, the desire for beauty, for pleasure, for experience, for meaning, are drives that every human being shares, twisted here beyond all recognition, but still, at their core, recognizable. The interior of a Slaaneshi vessel is a gallery, a concert hall, a pleasure palace, and a torture chamber all at once. Every surface is decorated with art that ranges from the transcendently beautiful to the profoundly disturbing, often simultaneously. Music fills every corridor, composed and performed by musicians whose skill is matched only by their madness. melodies that can make the listener weep with joy or scream with agony or both at once. The very materials from which the ship is constructed have been chosen for their sensory properties. Metals that sing when touched, fabrics that shift color in response to emotion, glass that magnifies or distorts the light to create effects that are as disorienting as they are beautiful. The crew of a Slaaneshi vessel are connoisseurs of experience, collectors of sensation, aesthetes whose quest for the perfect feeling has led them into territories of the human psyche that no one else has dared to explore. And they are artists and torturers, lovers and killers, creators of beauty so perfect it can stop a heart, and architects of suffering so exquisite it can shatter a mind. They seek not just pleasure, but all sensation, and they pursue this goal with a dedication and a discipline that would be admirable if it were not directed toward ends that are utterly, irrevocably dark. For the slaves aboard a Slaaneshi vessel, the experience is paradoxically both the most pleasant and the most terrible of any chaos ship. They are fed well, clothed well, housed in quarters that are comfortable by the standards of any warship. Their masters are not casually violent in the way that cornate marines are. They do not inflict suffering randomly or thoughtlessly. Instead, they inflict it carefully, deliberately, with the precision of surgeons and the creativity of artists, extracting from their victims responses that are mapped and catalogued and refined over centuries of practice. The slaves are materials for the creation of art, and the art that is created from their suffering is, in its own terrible way, magnificent. The comm systems of Slaaneshi ships are known to broadcast on all frequencies when entering combat. The sounds that emerge from these broadcasts, the moans, the screams, the giggles, the music, have been known to incapacitate enemy crew members who hear them, their minds overwhelmed by sensory input that their brains were never designed to process. Some ships of the Emperor's Children carry weapons called siren cannons that fire small psychic blasts designed to demoralize enemy crews, each impact spreading a wave of despair and longing that saps the will to fight. Others use a power called Slaanesh's Promise, a cone of warp energy that enraptures the minds of enemy crews, making them want to welcome the inhabitants of the Slaaneshi vessel aboard their own ship with open arms and willing hearts. It is a seduction, this. Everything about life aboard a Slaaneshi vessel is a seduction, a gradual erosion of the boundaries between pleasure and pain, between desire and revulsion, between the self and the other. The slaves aboard these vessels do not break the way slaves on other chaos ships break. They melt, they dissolve. They become part of the ship's ecosystem of sensation, their individual identities fading into a collective experience of feeling that is as vast and as shallow as an ocean. But we are not done yet. Not by a long measure. We have talked about the gods and their ships, but we have not yet explored some of the most crucial aspects of daily existence aboard these vessels. Let us continue our descent into the labyrinth. Let us talk about sleep, about rest, about what happens when the mortal body can no longer sustain consciousness and demands the oblivion of slumber, even when that oblivion is the most dangerous state a person can enter aboard a chaos warship. Sleep aboard a chaos ship is not restful. It cannot be, because the warp does not recognize the boundary between waking and sleeping minds. If anything, a sleeping mind is more vulnerable to the warp's influence, more open to the whispers and visions and nightmares that press against the thin barrier of reality with the patience of an ocean wearing away a cliff. The dreams that come to those who sleep aboard a chaos vessel are not ordinary dreams. They are communications, whether intentional or not, from entities that exist in a dimension where thought and reality are the same thing. The slaves learn quickly to sleep in shifts, in groups, never alone, because a person who sleeps alone aboard a chaos ship is a person who may not wake up as the same person who fell asleep. The nightmares are bad enough, visions of impossible landscapes populated by entities whose forms defy description. But worse than the nightmares is the waking, the slow return to consciousness accompanied by the lingering feeling that something has followed you back from the dream, that something has taken up residence in the corners of your mind that were empty before you closed your eyes. While some slaves develop techniques to minimize the danger, they sleep sitting up, with their backs against the wall, maintaining a level of alertness that prevents them from falling into the deepest stages of sleep where the warp's influence is strongest. Others meditate before sleeping, focusing their minds on simple, concrete thoughts that serve as anchors against the psychic currents that flow through the ship. Still others rely on chemical aids, stimulants that keep them awake for days at a time, postponing sleep until exhaustion makes it unavoidable, and hoping that the sheer depth of their fatigue will push them past the dangerous dream states and into the dreamless oblivion that is the closest thing to safety their situation offers. The Chaos Space Marines themselves handle sleep very differently. Their transhuman biology allows them to function with far less rest than a normal human, and when they do sleep, their enhanced minds are better equipped to resist the warp's intrusions. Many Chaos Space Marines have learned to treat their dreams as a source of intelligence rather than a threat, interpreting the visions that come to them as messages from their patron gods or warnings of dangers to come. The Night Lords, in particular, have a tradition of prophetic dreaming that stretches back to their primarch, Conrad Kersey, whose visions of the future drove him to madness and shaped the destiny of his entire legion. But even for the Space Marines, sleep is not without risk. The tale of the Night Lord known as Talos, the Soul Hunter, illustrates this clearly. His prophetic visions came to him unbidden, and in moments of sleep and unconsciousness, and they showed him things that no mortal or transhuman mind should be forced to witness. The fall of worlds, the death of brothers, the slow corruption of everything he once held dear. These visions were a gift from the warp, but they were also a curse, a constant reminder that even the mightiest warrior aboard a chaos ship is, in the end, at the mercy of forces that are older and more powerful than anything human. Let us talk now about the lower decks. Every ship has them, those spaces that are so deep within the vessel's structure that they might as well be in another world entirely. On an Imperial warship, the lower decks are the domain of the press-ganged ratings, the lowest members of the crew hierarchy, who toil in conditions of grinding misery and brutality that would be considered scandalous on any civilized world. Imperial lower decks are bad. They are infamous for their harshness, but they are still, fundamentally, human spaces, governed by human customs and human cruelty. The lower decks of a Chaos warship are something else entirely. Begin with the physical environment. The lower decks are the oldest part of the ship, the sections that were built first and have had the longest exposure to the warp's corrupting influence. The walls here are not metal. They have not been metal for centuries, perhaps millennia. They are a fusion of mineral and organic material, a living surface that sweats and breathes and occasionally pulses with a slow, unrhythmic movement that suggests the beating of an enormous heart somewhere deep within the ship's structure. The floor is uneven, covered in a layer of biological matter that might be fungus or might be something else entirely, something that grows in the absence of light and feeds on the psychic energy that permeates every atom of the vessel. The darkness here is absolute. Not the cultivated darkness of the Night Lord's upper decks, where the lighting has been deliberately disabled for aesthetic and tactical purposes, but the natural darkness of a place that was never meant to be seen by human eyes. The slaves who work in the lower decks carry their own light sources, dim chemical glow sticks or sputtering oil lanterns that create tiny islands of illumination in the vast, pressing blackness. These lights serve not just to guide their way, but to ward off the things that live in the dark, the creatures that have evolved or been created or simply manifested in the spaces between the walls, feeding on the ship's ambient psychic energy and the occasional unwary slave who strays too far from the beaten path. What lives in the lower decks? That depends on the ship and on how deep you are willing to go. In the upper reaches of the lower decks, the life forms are mostly recognizable, if corrupted. rats and insects that have been mutated by warp exposure into forms that their ancestors would not recognize, but that still fill the same ecological niches they always have, scavenging, breeding, and serving as food for the slaves who catch them. Deeper down, the fauna becomes more exotic. Are warp-spawned creatures that have no natural analogue, things that might be parasites or might be symbionts, or might be the physical manifestation of the ship's subconscious, drifting through the corridors like ghosts, made of half-formed flesh. And in the deepest reaches, the places where even the most desperate slaves do not venture, there are things that defy categorization entirely. Entities that exist partially in the material universe and partially in the warp, beings of pure psychic energy that have coalesced into semi-physical forms, impressions left by events of extreme violence or suffering that have been repeated so many times that they have worn grooves in reality itself. These are the ship's ghosts, though they are not dead and they are not memories. They are something else. In something that the warp creates when raw psychic energy is concentrated in a confined space for long enough, and they are as much a part of the ship as the engines and the weapons and the hull. The lower decks are also where the ship's most dangerous passengers are kept. The demon engines, those unholy fusions of machine and warp entity, are stored in bays deep within the vessel's structure, their chains and wards checked and rechecked by warpsmiths who know that a single failure could result in a rampage that would tear the ship apart from the inside. These engines are not simply weapons waiting to be deployed. They are prisoners, entities that have been bound against their will into shells of metal and ceramite, and their rage at their confinement is a palpable thing, or a pressure that can be felt by anyone who comes within their vicinity. The slaves who are tasked with cleaning the bays and performing basic maintenance on the daemon engines are among the most unfortunate beings aboard the ship, their sanity eroded by constant exposure to the malevolent intelligence that seethes within every rivet and weld. Helldrakes sometimes cling to the exterior hull of a chaos warship like bats roosting beneath a cave overhang, feeding on the vessel's energy through cables and pipes. But others claim territories within the ship itself, daring anyone to oppose them, their twisted fighter frames wedged into spaces barely large enough to contain them. These creatures were once fighter aircraft flown by space marines during the Great Crusade. Their pilots are still inside, fused to their machines for eternity, and reduced to nothing more than fetal remnants of screaming flesh that power the demon's hunger for destruction. The lower decks near a Helldrake's territory are always empty of slaves. The creatures tolerate the presence of Chaos Space Marines sometimes, but they have no such patience for mortals. Let us talk about something else now. Something that connects the physical reality of the Chaos ship to the wider strategic picture of the Long War. Let us talk about the Eye of Terror, the great warp rift that serves as the primary home and launching point for the majority of Chaos warfleets. The Eye of Terror is not simply a hole in space. It is a region where the material universe and the warp overlap, creating an environment that is neither fully one thing nor the other. Within the Eye, the laws of physics apply inconsistently, as time flows at different rates in different locations, sometimes running forward, sometimes backward, sometimes not running at all. Space itself is unstable, with the distances between points changing unpredictably, so that a journey that should take days might take years or minutes, or might loop back on itself and deposit the traveler at their starting point with no memory of the trip. For the Chaos warfleets that call the Eye home, this environment is both sanctuary and prison. It protects them from Imperial retribution, because any Imperial fleet that ventured deep into the Eye would be torn apart by the warp storms that rage within it. But it also traps them, because the same instability that makes the Eye impenetrable to outsiders makes it nearly impossible for the inhabitants to leave in any organized fashion. The Chaos renegades, who call the Eye home, simply launch their ships into the swirling energies of the warp and trust fortune and the whims of the ruinous powers to carry them to their enemies. This makes Chaos attacks on Imperial space random, sudden, and unpredictable, which is both a strength and a weakness. Strength because it makes the attacks impossible to anticipate and defend against. Weakness because it makes large-scale coordinated operations extraordinarily difficult to execute. The daily experience of a ship within the eye is unlike anything else in the galaxy. The view from the exterior sensors, assuming the sensors are functioning and can be trusted, which is by no means guaranteed, is a constantly shifting panorama of impossible colors and impossible shapes, and a visual representation of the warp's psychic energy rendered in wavelengths that the human eye was never designed to process. Stars appear and disappear. Planets drift through space like jellyfish through an ocean, their surfaces alive with movement and change, and everywhere, threading through the stars and the planets and the empty spaces between them, the stuff of the warp itself flows, a river of psychic energy that carries within it the emotions and memories and nightmares of every sentient being who has ever lived or will ever live. For the mortals aboard these ships, living within the eye means living in a state of constant, low-grade exposure to warp energy. This exposure has cumulative effects. Physical mutations are the most visible, and the extra limbs and misshapen features and strange growths that mark the inhabitants of the eye as surely as a brand marks livestock. But the psychological effects are equally profound and far less visible. Memory becomes unreliable. Perception becomes untrustworthy. The boundary between internal experience and external reality becomes blurred, so that a person is never entirely sure whether what they are seeing and hearing and feeling is real, or whether it is a projection of their own psyche, amplified and reflected back at them by the warp. This is the environment in which Chaos warbands compete for survival, fighting each other as often as they fight the Imperium, battling over resources and territory and slaves, and the favor of gods who reward success and punish failure with equal enthusiasm. Even if a warband is lucky enough to control a planet in the eye, with a semblance of industry and means of production, they must constantly defend it against rival warbands seeking to raid and conquer. The denizens of the Eye of Terror are in a constant state of war with each other for reasons as diverse as supplies, territory, clean drinking water, or sometimes simply for the sake of power, pride, and glory. The Dark Mechanicum controls various forge worlds within the Eye, where they produce and sell all kinds of war supplies up to and including warships and Chaos Titans. But even the Dark Mechanicum is by no means unified. It is splintered into countless tiny domains, divided by bitter philosophical disputes about the nature of technology, the role of demonic energy in mechanical systems, and the fundamental question of whether progress is possible or whether all change is merely a different expression of the same eternal decay. Technological devices do not work properly inside the Eye of Terror, suffering from a variety of malfunctions due to the corrupting influence of the warp. This is the reason why Chaos Space Marines so willingly pay the steep prices charged by the Dark Mechanicum for their services. Because the alternative is watching your ship's systems degrade and fail one by one until you are drifting powerless in a sea of psychic energy with nothing between you and oblivion but a failing hull and a prayer that no god will answer honestly. Let us turn now to one of the most fascinating and least discussed aspects of life aboard a Chaos ship: the role of psychers, sorcerers, and those who wield the power of the warp directly. On an Imperial vessel, psychers are treated with a mixture of necessity and loathing. They are essential for navigation, for communication, for 1,000 vital functions that keep the ship operational and the Imperium connected. But they are also feared, and rightly so, because every psyker is a potential gateway for demonic incursion, a living door that the entities of the warp are constantly trying to push open. Imperial psychers are controlled through rigorous training, psychic dampening, and the ever-present oversight of the Inquisition, which stands ready to execute any psyker who shows signs of corruption or loss of control. Aboard a Chaos ship, the relationship between psychers and the rest of the crew is fundamentally different. Psychic power is not feared, it is celebrated. It is the currency of influence, the measure of a being's worth, the most direct connection to the Chaos gods, whose power sustains the entire enterprise. Sorcerers, those Chaos Space Marines who have cultivated their psychic abilities through millennia of study and practice, occupy positions of enormous influence within most warbands. They serve as the ship's primary navigators, guiding the vessel through the warp using their psychic sight in place of or in addition to the mutant navigators who serve the same function aboard Imperial ships. They serve as advisors to the warband's lord, their prophetic abilities and arcane knowledge providing insights that inform tactical and strategic decisions. They serve as weapons of devastating power, as capable of unleashing psychic attacks that can devastate enemy ships from a distance or summoning demons to fight alongside the warband in battle. The Thousand Sons, the former legion of Magnus the Red, are the supreme practitioners of this art. Their ships are floating universities of the arcane, repositories of forbidden knowledge that has been accumulated over 10,000 years of obsessive study. The sorcerers who crew these vessels spend their non-combat hours in constant research, poring over ancient texts, conducting experiments with psychic phenomena, and engaged in the elaborate multi-layered plotting that is the hallmark of Tzeentch's followers. Their mortal attendants are often psykers themselves, humans whose latent psychic abilities have been awakened and cultivated by their transhuman masters, as transformed from raw potential into focused instruments of warp manipulation. But psychic power aboard a Chaos ship is not limited to the sorcerers and their trained acolytes. The warp's influence permeates every aspect of life aboard these vessels, and this means that psychic phenomena are a constant, everyday occurrence. Slaves develop minor psychic abilities that they never had before, the ability to sense the presence of approaching overseers, the ability to communicate with each other over short distances through thought alone, the ability to manipulate small objects without touching them. These abilities are a mixed blessing. They can help a slave survive in an environment where information is power and surprise is death. But they also mark the slave as someone the warp has touched, in someone who has been changed by the forces that permeate the ship, and that kind of attention is rarely welcome from any quarter. The most powerful psychic phenomena aboard a Chaos ship occur during warp transit, when the vessel is fully immersed in the dimension of psychic energy that is the god's domain. During these transits, the boundary between the physical and the psychic becomes almost non-existent, and the experiences of the crew become correspondingly surreal. Walls bleed, gravity reverses without warning, voices speak from empty rooms, delivering messages that are simultaneously meaningless and profoundly significant. The dead appear, walking the corridors in forms that are simultaneously comforting and horrible, as delivering warnings and accusations and declarations of love that are all the more painful for being perfectly genuine and completely impossible. The navigators who guide Chaos ships through the warp deserve special mention here. On an Imperial vessel, the navigator occupies a position of privilege and protection, a valuable asset who is housed in a sealed chamber at the top of the ship and shielded from the warp by multiple layers of psychic and physical barriers. The navigator's job is to perceive the warp through their third eye, the mutation that defines their caste, and to chart a course through the turbulent psychic currents that will bring the ship to its destination with a minimum of risk and delay. Aboard a Chaos ship, the navigator's situation is considerably more precarious. Some Chaos warbands employ captured Imperial navigators, enslaved through a combination of physical restraint and psychic coercion, forced to guide their captors' ships through the warp on pain of torments that make death seem like a holiday. These navigators are trapped in a waking nightmare, their third eye forced open to perceive a warp that is far more turbulent and far more hostile than anything they would encounter aboard an Imperial vessel, their minds battered by psychic forces that they have been trained to resist, but that the conditions aboard a Chaos ship make almost impossible to withstand. Other warbands use corrupted navigators, members of navigator houses who have been turned to chaos through persuasion, coercion, or the gradual seepage of corruption that comes from prolonged exposure to warp energy. Whilst these navigators are more willing participants in the ship's mission, but their corruption has also affected their abilities in unpredictable ways. Some can see further into the warp than any uncorrupted navigator, perceiving currents and eddies and shortcuts that their loyalist counterparts cannot detect. Others have been blinded by their corruption, their third eye consumed by the very energies it was designed to perceive, leaving them dependent on other senses and methods of navigation entirely. And some warbands, particularly those most deeply immersed in the worship of chaos, use sorcerers or even bound demons as navigators, replacing the biological third eye of the navigator caste with the psychic sight of beings who exist simultaneously in the material universe and the warp. Or this method of navigation is considerably more dangerous than any other because the entities performing the navigation have their own agendas that may or may not align with the interests of the ship's crew. A demon bound to serve as a navigator might guide the ship safely to its destination, or it might guide it into the heart of a warp storm, because the demon's master has decided that the crew's suffering would be more entertaining than their survival. The word-bearers, those most fanatical of all chaos devotees, have been known to deactivate their Geller fields entirely during warp transit, seeing the exposure of the ship and crew to the raw energies of the warp as a form of communion with the ruinous powers. This practice is extraordinarily dangerous even by the standards of chaos worship, and it results in ships that are so thoroughly saturated with warp energy that they are, for all practical purposes, pieces of the Imperium that happen to exist in a form that resembles a starship. The crew of these vessels are often barely recognizable as human, their bodies and minds warped by constant, unfiltered exposure to psychic forces that would drive an ordinary person irrevocably insane within moments of contact. Let us discuss now what happens between battles, during those stretches of time that might last days or decades or centuries, when the ship is simply existing, drifting through the warp or orbiting a demon world, or hiding in the shadow of a dead star, waiting for the next call to war. These periods of relative quiet are, in some ways, more dangerous than the battles themselves. Battle, for all its horror, provides structure. It provides purpose. It gives the crew something to do, something to focus on, something that demands their attention and their energy, and leaves no room for the kind of existential contemplation that is the greatest threat to sanity aboard a chaos ship. Between battles, when there is nothing to fight and nothing to do but maintain the ship and survive, the crew is left alone with their thoughts, and their thoughts are not always their own. The Chaos Space Marines handle these periods in ways that reflect their legion's culture and their personal inclinations. The World Eaters, unable to simply stop fighting, turn on each other, engaging in arena combat that serves as both training and worship. Their ships ring with the clash of weapons and the roar of crowds day and night, and a perpetual gladiatorial spectacle that keeps the blood flowing and the blood god satisfied. The body count from these practice bouts is significant, but the World Eaters consider this an acceptable cost. A warrior who falls in the arena was not worthy of the Skull Throne's notice and is better replaced by someone who is. The word-bearers fill the time between battles with religious observance. Their ships become temples, every surface consecrated with the symbols of the dark gods, every hour filled with prayer and ritual and the study of sacred texts. Dark apostles deliver sermons that last for days, their voices echoing through the ship's cathedral decks as they exhort the faithful to greater devotion and promise that the next battle will bring them closer to the ultimate goal of drowning the galaxy in the truth of chaos. Oh, these sermons are not optional. Attendance is mandatory for all crew, mortal and marine alike, and the punishments for absence or inattention are creative and severe. The Night Lords, those princes of darkness, spend their downtime in ways that are characteristically sinister. They maintain extensive trophy collections, walls and chambers decorated with the flayed skin and preserved skulls of their victims, arranged with an artistic sensibility that is as disturbing as it is undeniable. They also engage in the ongoing psychological warfare that defines their legion's approach to everything, manipulating their mortal crew through fear and the careful management of terror. maintaining the atmosphere of constant, pervasive dread that they consider as essential to their identity as their midnight blue armor and their lightning bolt insignia. The Iron Warriors, those bitter architects of destruction, use the time between battles to plan and build. Their ships contain extensive workshops and foundries where new weapons are designed, new fortifications are modeled, and new siege engines are constructed from salvaged materials and the products of their dark forges. The Iron Warriors are, in their own corrupted way, among the most productive of all the traitor legions, their relentless focus on engineering and construction keeping them occupied and grounded in a way that the followers of less structured gods often cannot manage. And the mortal crew? What do they do in the long hours between battles? They survive. That is the short answer. They survive by doing whatever they must, performing whatever tasks their masters assign, eating whatever food is available, in sleeping whenever they can find a safe place to close their eyes. But they also do something else, something that is more surprising and more human than the grim circumstances of their existence might suggest. They create. Among the slave populations of Chaos warships, there exists a rich and largely unrecorded tradition of art, storytelling, and music. These are not the grand creations of the Emperor's children or the arcane masterworks of the Thousand Suns. They are small, personal, and deeply human expressions, scratched into bulkhead walls with improvised tools, whispered from parent to child in the darkness of the sleeping quarters, sung in voices that are rough from disease and exhaustion, but that carry a melody that no Chaos god has claimed as their own. The stories tell of a galaxy beyond the ship, a galaxy where the sun shines and the air is clean, and people live and die without the constant shadow of ancient, malevolent intelligences looming over their every waking moment. Some of these stories are memories, passed down from the earliest slaves who were captured from imperial worlds, and who carried with them fragments of a culture that their descendants have never directly experienced. Others are inventions, created from whole cloth by imaginations that refuse to be confined by the walls of a warship, no matter how corrupted those walls might be. The music is perhaps the most poignant expression of this hidden culture. It exists in defiance of everything that the Chaos ship represents, a tiny flame of human creativity burning in the darkness of a vessel that has been designed. From every corrupted rivet to every demon-inhabited circuit, to extinguish exactly this kind of light. The slaves sing work songs, rhythmic chants that help them coordinate their labor, and that serve, incidentally, as a form of communal bonding, though what they are bonding over is a question that most of them prefer not to examine too closely. They sing lullabies to their children, soft melodies that seem to grow quieter and quieter as you move away from the sleeping quarters, as if the music itself is trying to escape the notice of the things that listen in the walls. This hidden culture of the slave population is one of the most remarkable and least appreciated aspects of life aboard a Chaos ship. It suggests that even in the most extreme conditions, even when subjected to pressures that would seem to make creativity impossible, the human impulse to make meaning, to tell stories, to create beauty, to assert the existence of an inner life that belongs to the individual and not to their masters, endures. It does not flourish. It does not triumph. It does not change the fundamental reality of the slave's situation one bit. But it exists, and its existence is a quiet, persistent refutation of the idea that Chaos can claim absolute dominion over the human spirit. Let us talk about one more thing before we shift our focus. Let us talk about what happens when someone dies aboard a Chaos ship. Death on an Imperial warship is handled with a degree of ceremony that reflects the Imperium's complicated relationship with mortality. The dead are honored, or at least acknowledged. Their bodies are recycled, as are all things in the resource-scarce environment of a starship. But this recycling is preceded by whatever funeral rites the ship's chaplain deems appropriate. A prayer, a moment of silence, a notation in the ship's records that marks the passing of a human life. On a Chaos ship, death is handled very differently, and the manner of its handling depends almost entirely on who is doing the dying. When a Chaos Space Marine falls in battle, the response of his warband depends on the Legion's traditions and the circumstances of the death. The Word-bearers honor their fallen warriors by carving the 8-pointed star of Chaos undivided on their foreheads and daubing their eyelids with blood, while performing elaborate funeral rites that can last for days. Some warrior champions among the Word-bearers are honored even more personally, their brothers harvesting trophies from the body and consuming the fallen warrior's heart, sharing the meat among the surviving members of his squad. Gene seed, the precious biological material that allows the creation of new Space Marines, is always harvested when possible, extracted from the fallen warrior's body by the warband's apothecary with a speed and skill born of 10,000 years of relentless practice. When a mortal crew member dies, the response is considerably less ceremonial. In most cases, it is not a response at all. The body is simply removed from whatever space it occupies, stripped of any useful materials, clothing, tools, cybernetic implants, and disposed of in whatever manner is most convenient. Some ships have disposal chutes that dump bodies into the ship's reclamation systems, where they are broken down into raw materials. Others simply eject bodies into the void, letting the vacuum handle the disposal. And on some ships, particularly those dedicated to Nurgle, the dead are left where they fall, their decomposing bodies becoming part of the ship's ecosystem, feeding the fungal growths and bacterial colonies that cover every surface. There are exceptions to this general indifference. Slaves who have served their masters well, who have earned a degree of respect through years of loyal and competent service, may receive something approaching a dignified send-off. A warpsmith might mark the passing of a particularly skilled artificer by inscribing the slave's name on a piece of equipment they helped maintain, as a small and meaningless gesture by the standards of the wider galaxy, but one that carries enormous significance in an environment where individual identity is constantly being eroded by forces beyond anyone's control. A Night Lord might acknowledge the death of a favored slave with a moment of silence, not out of grief, which is an emotion that 10,000 years of warfare have largely burned away, but out of a pragmatic recognition that replacing a skilled servant is inconvenient. But for the vast majority of the mortal dead, there is nothing, no ceremony, no acknowledgement, no record. They simply cease to exist, their lives ending as unremarked as they were lived, swallowed by the ship that consumed them while they were alive, and that continues to consume them after they are dead. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of life and death aboard a Chaos ship. Not the violence or the suffering or the constant threat of annihilation, but the absolute, crushing anonymity of it all. The knowledge that when you die, there will be no one who remembers that you were ever here at all. Let us consider now the very rare but incredibly significant phenomenon of escape. Is it possible to escape from a Chaos ship? Can a slave, a captive, an unwilling participant in the long war find a way out of the nightmare and back to something resembling normal existence? The answer is that it is theoretically possible, but practically almost impossible. The obstacles are enormous and layered upon one another like the walls of a fortress. First, the slave would need to find a way off the ship, which means either stealing a shuttle or escape pod, both of which are closely guarded and monitored, or somehow making it to the ship's exterior, which is exposed to the vacuum of space or, worse, the unfiltered warp. Second, assuming they managed to leave the ship, they would need to navigate to an Imperial-controlled system, which requires either navigational equipment they almost certainly do not have, or an extraordinarily lucky drift through real space that deposits them somewhere within reach of Imperial forces. Third, assuming they managed to reach Imperial space, they would need to convince the Imperial authorities of their identity and their loyalty, which is enormously difficult when they have been aboard a Chaos ship long enough to have been changed by the experience, physically, psychologically, and spiritually, in ways that cannot be hidden or undone. the Inquisition, or at the Imperium's secret police and its primary defense against the corruption of chaos, takes a particularly dim view of anyone who has spent time in close proximity to the forces of the dark gods. Even the most sympathetic inquisitor would subject an escaped chaos slave to extensive interrogation, psychic scanning, and physical examination before allowing them to return to anything approaching normal life. And many inquisitors would simply execute the escaped slave as a precautionary measure, reasoning that the risk of chaos contamination is too great to justify the compassion of allowing them to live and potentially spread whatever seeds of corruption might have been planted in their soul. Despite all of this, escapes do occasionally occur. They are the stuff of legend within the slave populations of chaos ships, and stories whispered from generation to generation, like myths of impossible heroes who defied the very gods and lived to tell the tale. Some of these stories are true, most are not. All of them serve the same vital function, maintaining the desperate, fragile, absolutely essential belief that escape is possible, that there is a world beyond the hull of this ship, that the nightmare they are living has an ending somewhere, even if the odds of reaching that ending are so small as to be essentially invisible. There are also those who find a kind of escape without ever leaving the ship. The meditators of certain slave communities, for instance, who withdraw into themselves so completely that the horrors around them cease to register, as achieving through sheer force of will a state of inner detachment that the chaos gods find boring and therefore do not bother to corrupt. The artists who lose themselves so completely in their creative work that they achieve something approaching transcendence, their minds focused on the act of creation with an intensity that leaves no room for the warp's whispers. And the broken ones, those slaves who have been pushed so far beyond the limits of sanity that they have passed through madness and out the other side into a state that is not quite sanity and not quite insanity, but something else entirely, a condition that renders them invisible to the predators of the warp, because there is nothing left in them that the predators recognize as worth consuming. These internal escapes are, in their own way, as remarkable as any physical flight from the ship. They represent the human mind's extraordinary capacity for adaptation, its ability to find refuge within itself even when every external refuge has been stripped away. They are not victories in any conventional sense. They do not change the material conditions of the slave's existence by even the smallest measure. But they prove something important, something that the chaos gods would prefer to deny, and that the law of this universe suggests again and again, that there is a part of the human being that cannot be fully reached by corruption, a core of identity and awareness that persists even in conditions designed to destroy it utterly. Let us talk about one more thing before we begin to draw our journey to a close. Let us talk about the ship itself as a character, and as an entity with its own personality and its own agenda, because this is one of the most fascinating and unsettling aspects of Chaos Warship lore that we have only touched upon. We have noted the organic growths, the shifting corridors, the demon-inhabited systems, the sense that the ship is somehow alive and aware of its occupants. But let us dwell on it more deliberately now, because it is central to understanding what makes life aboard a chaos vessel fundamentally different from life aboard any other kind of ship. An Imperial warship has what is called a machine spirit, a semi-sentient intelligence that inhabits the ship's systems and gives it a kind of personality. Machine spirits are not well understood, even by the tech priests who spend their lives working alongside them. They seem to be a combination of programming, a psychic imprint, and something else that defies easy categorization. An Imperial ship's machine spirit can make the difference between victory and defeat in battle, responding to threats with a speed and creativity that purely mechanical systems cannot match. Ship captains develop relationships with their vessel's machine spirit over years and decades of service, learning its quirks and preferences and treating it with a respect that borders on genuine affection. A Chaos warship's machine spirit has been corrupted or replaced entirely by something else, something darker and hungrier and far more aware. In some cases, the original machine spirit has been warped by warp exposure into something more aggressive, a feral intelligence that hungers for destruction and resents the crew that inhabits it like parasites within a host. In other cases, the machine spirit has been consumed by a demon that now inhabits the ship's systems, using the vessel as its body and the crew as its servants or its sustenance, depending on the demon's mood that particular day. The result is a ship that has a will of its own, and that will does not always align with the wishes of its nominal masters. The ship might change course without warning, drawn by some instinct or compulsion that only it can perceive. It might refuse to fire its weapons at certain targets, or it might fire at targets that its captain did not designate and does not want destroyed. It might seal off sections of its interior for no apparent reason, or open sections that have been sealed for centuries, revealing chambers full of things that the crew wish had remained hidden in the dark forever. The most extreme example of this phenomenon is the demon ship, which we discussed earlier, a vessel that has been so thoroughly possessed by warp entities that the mortal crew, if any remain, are little more than passengers aboard a being that has its own desires, its own destination, and its own terrible purpose. But even short of this extreme, every Chaos warship possesses a degree of autonomy that makes it an unpredictable and sometimes terrifying companion to those who travel within it. The ship knows things. It remembers things. It has been alive in one form or another for 10,000 years, and in that time it has accumulated experiences and memories and grudges that span the width of the entire galaxy. It remembers the Great Crusade, when it was new and bright and full of the promise of a golden age. It remembers the heresy, when its crew turned against each other and its corridors ran with the blood of brothers who had fought side by side for decades. It remembers the long war, the endless parade of battles and retreats and betrayals and desperate triumphs that has defined its existence ever since. And it carries all of these memories in its corrupted structure, encoded in the organic growths that cover its interior and the demonic intelligences that inhabit its systems, a living archive of 10,000 years of grief and fury and bloodshed. To live aboard such a vessel is to live inside a creature that is as aware of you as you are of it. It watches through sensors that are not entirely mechanical. It listens through systems that are not entirely technological. It knows when you are afraid and it feeds on that fear, using it as fuel for the psychic processes that keep its systems functioning and its hull intact. It knows when you are angry and it channels that anger into its weapons, making them more effective in battle and more unstable in peacetime. It knows when you are happy, on those rare occasions when happiness is possible, and it seems to resent that happiness, as though joy is an insult to the suffering that defines its own existence. Living inside a Chaos warship is like living inside the belly of a great beast, a creature that has swallowed you whole and is slowly, patiently digesting you, not to destroy you, but to make you part of itself. And the truly terrifying thing is that, given enough time, it succeeds. The longest-serving crew members aboard a Chaos warship are, in a very real sense, part of the ship. They have breathed its air and eaten its food and slept within its walls for so long that the boundary between their biology and the ship's biology has become blurred beyond recognition. Their flesh has begun to take on the same organic metallic quality as the ship's interior. Their minds have begun to resonate with the same psychic frequencies as the ship's corrupted systems. They are becoming the ship, and the ship is becoming them, and the process is so gradual and so subtle that by the time they notice it, if they notice it at all, it is far too late to reverse what has been done. This, then, is the ultimate fate of those who live aboard a Chaos warship. Not death, which would be simple and merciful and finite. Not damnation, which would at least have the virtue of resolution, but absorption, integration, the slow, inexorable process of being consumed by the vessel that carries you, until there is no distinction between the passenger and the prison, between the crew and the ship, between the living and the dead, and the thing that feeds on both. Let us now explore a dimension of chaos ship life that we have so far only grazed the surface of. The relationship between the different factions and groups that share the confined space of a single vessel. Because a chaos warship is not a monolithic entity. It is a floating ecosystem of competing interests, overlapping jurisdictions, and simmering rivalries that can erupt into open violence at the slightest provocation, or sometimes for no provocation at all. Consider the political dynamics aboard a typical chaos warship. At the top, you have the warband's lord and his immediate circle of lieutenants, his champions and advisors. Below them, you have the rank-and-file Chaos Space Marines, organized into squads or claws or coteries depending on the Legion's traditions. Below them, the specialized functionaries, the warpsmiths and their acolytes, the sorcerers and their attendants, the Dark Apostles and their congregations. And below all of them, the vast mortal population of slaves, serfs, and cultists who keep the ship running through their labor and their suffering. Each of these groups has its own agenda, its own priorities, and its own definition of what constitutes acceptable behavior. The Lord wants to pursue whatever campaign or objective has currently captured his attention. His lieutenants want to advance their own positions within the warband, preferably by demonstrating their worth to the Lord, but also, when the opportunity presents itself, by undermining their rivals. The rank-and-file Marines want glory, power, and the favor of whatever god they serve. The specialists want the resources and autonomy they need to pursue their particular obsessions, whether those obsessions involve the forging of demon engines, the perfection of sorcerous arts, or the spread of divine corruption. And the slaves want, above all else, to survive another day without being murdered, sacrificed, eaten, or absorbed into the ship's biomechanical infrastructure. These competing interests create a constant, low-level tension that permeates every interaction aboard the ship. A conversation between two Chaos Space Marines is never just a conversation. It is a negotiation, a probe, a test of strength conducted through the medium of words rather than weapons. Every question has a hidden purpose. Every answer has a calculated effect. Every silence is a statement, and every statement is a potential weapon. The paranoia that results from living in this environment is not a psychological disorder. It is a survival strategy, a rational response to a situation in which everyone around you is, to some degree, your enemy, even the ones who call you brother and fight beside you in battle. This internal conflict occasionally erupts into outright violence. Duels between Chaos Space Marines are common, fought over perceived insults, disagreements about strategy, disputes over the distribution of loot, or simply because one warrior has decided that another's existence is no longer to be tolerated. These duels are sometimes formalized, conducted according to whatever rules of honor the warband still observes, with seconds and witnesses and predetermined boundaries. More often, they are spontaneous, vicious, and conducted in whatever section of the ship the combatants happen to occupy at the time, with collateral damage to the surrounding environment and its unfortunate inhabitants considered an acceptable cost of doing business. More serious conflicts, those that involve entire squads or factions within the warband, can escalate into running battles that rage through the ship's corridors for hours or days, leaving sections of the vessel damaged or depressurized and the slave population significantly diminished. These mini-civil wars are eventually resolved, either through the intervention of the warband's lord, who has a vested interest in preventing his forces from destroying themselves, or through the simple attrition of one side wearing the other down until the survivors are too exhausted or too depleted to continue fighting. The relationship between the Chaos Space Marines and their mortal followers is another source of constant tension. The Marines view the mortals as tools, resources to be used and discarded as the situation demands. The mortals view the Marines as gods or monsters or both simultaneously, beings of such overwhelming power that resistance is inconceivable, but that subservience is no guarantee of survival. This dynamic creates a relationship that is superficially simple. The strong command, the weak obey, but that is actually extraordinarily complex, layered with unspoken rules, customary protections, and informal understandings that have developed over centuries of coexistence. A slave who understands these unspoken rules can navigate the social landscape of a chaos ship with a reasonable chance of survival. They know which marines to approach and which to avoid. They know which sections of the ship are safe to traverse and which are claimed by particularly territorial warriors. They know when to make themselves visible and when to become invisible, when to speak and when to remain absolutely silent, when to demonstrate competence and when to feign incompetence so as not to attract the dangerous attention of masters who might decide that a particularly skilled slave would be more useful in some other, less survivable role. A slave who does not understand these rules, a newcomer fresh from capture, for instance, or a child who has not yet learned the ways of the ship, is in mortal danger every moment of every day. The ship's environment has no tolerance for ignorance, no patience for learning curves, no mercy for those who stumble. A wrong turn into a territorial marine's domain, a careless word spoken in the hearing of a sorcerer whose mood has turned dark, a moment of eye contact with a creature that should never have been looked at directly. Any of these can result in death so swift and so total that the victim's companions barely have time to register the loss before it is time to move on and continue surviving. The children born aboard chaos ships occupy a particularly precarious position in this social landscape. They are, in one sense, the ship's future, as the next generation of slaves whose labor will keep the vessel functioning for another century or another millennium. In another sense, they are nothing, interchangeable units of future labor with no individual value and no protection beyond what their parents can provide. The parents, slaves themselves, can provide very little. They can teach their children the rules, the unspoken codes of conduct that govern life aboard the ship. They can watch over them during the vulnerable hours of sleep. They can share their meager food rations, and they can prepare them, as gently as circumstances allow, for the reality that their lives will be short and brutal, and that the only kindness the universe is likely to offer them is the occasional, fleeting moment of human connection in the midst of the madness. And some children are taken from their parents at a young age and given to the Chaos Space Marines to be raised as potential recruits. Unlike the Loyalist Space Marine chapters, which recruit from death worlds and warrior cultures and subject their candidates to grueling but ultimately purposeful trials of selection, Chaos Warbands take their recruits from slave stock, subjecting them to the brutal process of gene seed implantation with none of the careful screening and preparation that the Imperium provides. The failure rate is staggering. The gene seed of the traitor legions, corrupted by 10,000 years of warp exposure, is less stable than its loyalist equivalent, and the human bodies it is implanted into are often poorly suited to receive it. For every successful creation of a new Chaos Space Marine, dozens of candidates die in agony as their bodies reject the implants or mutate in ways that render them useless for anything except disposal. Those who survive the process emerge as transhuman warriors, their humanity stripped away and replaced by something harder, faster, stronger, and infinitely more dangerous. They remember their origins, some of them. They remember being slaves, being children, being human. But these memories fade quickly, overwhelmed by the new sensations and new appetites that the gene seed brings with it, buried under layers of indoctrination and training, and the first, intoxicating taste of the power that the Chaos Gods offer to those who serve them with sufficient dedication and violence. Let us turn now to another crucial subject, one that we have referenced but not yet explored in the depth it deserves, or the topic of trade and commerce between Chaos vessels. Because Chaos warships do not exist in isolation, they are part of a larger ecosystem of Chaos forces that includes other warships, ground-based installations, demon worlds, and the scattered remnants of the Dark Mechanicum's industrial infrastructure. And where there is interaction, there is trade. Where there is trade, there are markets. And where there are markets, there are the messy, complicated, and occasionally violent dynamics of commerce conducted between parties who trust each other about as far as a bolter round can throw a battle tank. The primary commodities of trade among chaos forces are exactly what you would expect them to be in a society defined by war and worship. Weapons, ammunition, replacement parts for damaged equipment, a gene seed for the creation of new space marines, slaves which are the universal currency of the Eye of Terror, useful for labor, for sacrifice, and for the simple prestige of ownership, and information, which is perhaps the most valuable commodity of all, knowledge of enemy dispositions, knowledge of warp currents and safe passages, knowledge of the locations of salvageable space hulks or undefended Imperial convoys, knowledge that can be leveraged into power and power into survival. Trade between chaos vessels typically takes place at recognized meeting points, neutral locations within the Eye of Terror, where warbands gather to exchange goods, share intelligence, and conduct the diplomatic negotiations that determine the course of the long war. These meeting points are some of the most dangerous places in the galaxy, of volatile concentrations of paranoid, heavily armed warriors who are temporarily restraining their instinct to murder everyone within reach, because doing so would be bad for business. The diplomacy conducted at these gatherings is a high-wire act of threat and counter-threat, bluff and counter-bluff, with the ever-present possibility that negotiations will break down and the meeting will degenerate into a pitched battle between warbands that were supposed to be trading partners. The station known as Hell's Iris is one such gathering place, referenced in the Night Lord's novels as a port of call for various chaos warbands operating in the region of the Eye of Terror. It is a place where Night Lords and Word-bearers and Black Legion and 100 other factions rub shoulders in an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and barely contained violence, but where deals are struck over cups of something that was once alcohol but has been transformed by warp exposure into something that defies chemical analysis, and where the penalties for cheating on a deal are so severe that most traders find it more prudent to be honest, or at least to be dishonest in ways that cannot easily be traced back to them. The Dark Mechanicum plays a particularly important role in this economy. Their forge worlds produce the weapons, ammunition, and equipment that keep the armies of chaos in the field, and their tech priests are among the few beings in the Eye who possess the skills necessary to maintain and repair the ancient, corrupted technology that the Chaos warbands depend upon. The Dark Mechanicum's products are expensive, paid for in slaves and raw materials and artifacts of power, but they are also irreplaceable. A warband that loses its relationship with its Dark Mechanicum suppliers is a warband that will slowly but inevitably find itself outgunned, out-armored, and out-equipped by its rivals, a situation that, in the hyper-competitive environment of the Eye, is tantamount to a death sentence. This economic dimension of chaos warship life is rarely discussed in the broader lore, but it is essential to understanding how these vessels sustain themselves over the long millennia of the Long War. A chaos warship cannot simply raid Imperial worlds indefinitely. The targets must be chosen carefully, the raids planned with an eye to both military and economic objectives, the loot distributed in a manner that keeps the warband's various factions satisfied without giving any single faction too much power. The Lord of a Chaos warband is, among his many other roles, an economist, a logistics manager, a trade negotiator, and a political operator who must balance the competing demands of his followers, his suppliers, his allies, and his gods, with the ruthless pragmatism of a man who knows that the penalty for failure is not just death, but something much, much worse. Let us consider also the phenomenon of inter-warband alliances, those temporary coalitions that form when multiple chaos forces unite under a single banner for a specific campaign or objective. The most famous of these alliances are the Black Crusades, those massive chaos invasions of Imperial space that are led by Abaddon the Despoiler, Warmaster of Chaos, from his base in the Eye of Terror. 13 such crusades have been launched over the course of the Long War, each one gathering together dozens of warbands from across the spectrum of chaos allegiance and directing their combined fury against the Imperium's defenses. life aboard a Chaos ship during a Black Crusade is different from life during normal operations. The ship is part of something larger, a fleet of hundreds or thousands of vessels moving in rough formation toward a common objective. The usual isolation of the individual warband is replaced by a sense of collective purpose, a feeling that for once, the forces of chaos are not fighting each other, but are united against their common enemy. This feeling is exhilarating for the Chaos Space Marines, who remember, however dimly, what it was like to be part of a legion rather than a fractured warband, to fight alongside brothers rather than against them, armed to serve a cause rather than merely survive. For the mortal crew, a Black Crusade is both better and worse than normal operations. Better because the fleet's combined logistical infrastructure makes supplies more reliable, and the protection of traveling in a large group reduces the risk of being ambushed by rival warbands or Imperial patrols. Worse because the demands of the campaign are relentless, the work is harder, the casualties are higher, and the proximity of so many other Chaos forces means that the ambient level of warp corruption is significantly elevated, accelerating the process of mutation and madness that is the constant companion of every mortal aboard a Chaos vessel. The interpersonal dynamics during a Black Crusade are also considerably more complex. The warband must interact with other warbands whose cultures, traditions, and patron gods may be very different from their own. A Death Guard vessel operating alongside a World Eater's ship must navigate the fundamental incompatibility between Nurgle's philosophy of patient acceptance and Khorne's philosophy of immediate, explosive violence. 1,000 Suns. Sorcerer assigned to coordinate with an Iron Warrior's siege master must find a way to communicate across the gulf that separates Tzeentch's love of complexity from the Iron Warrior's preference for brutal, straightforward efficiency. These interactions are fascinating from a cultural perspective. They reveal the depth and diversity of Chaos culture, the way that 10,000 years of exile and corruption have produced a kaleidoscope of traditions, beliefs, and social structures that are as rich and varied as anything the Imperium has to offer, or even if their richness and variety are expressed in forms that would make an Imperial citizen vomit with horror and disgust. Now let us consider one final aspect of life aboard a Chaos warship that ties together many of the themes we have been discussing: the concept of time and what it does to the people who live within its distorted flow. We touched on this earlier, noting the temporal instability of the warp and the Eye of Terror. But let us explore it more deeply now, because the experience of time aboard a Chaos ship is perhaps the single most alien aspect of life in this environment, the one thing that separates it most completely from any other human experience. On an Imperial warship, time flows in one direction at a consistent rate. Days have a predictable length. Weeks follow a predictable pattern. When the crew ages at a rate that matches the passage of time in the outside universe. A sailor who spends 30 years aboard a warship will have aged 30 years when he finally returns to his homeworld. His children will have grown up. His friends will have aged alongside him. The universe outside the ship will have changed in ways that correspond to the time that has passed. This consistency is so fundamental to human experience that we barely notice it. Time is the bedrock upon which all other experience is built. Aboard a Chaos ship, this bedrock has been shattered. The temporal distortions caused by the warp mean that the flow of time aboard the vessel may bear no relationship to the flow of time in the outside universe. A journey that takes a week by the ship's internal chronometers might correspond to a century in real space, or a microsecond, or the ship might arrive at its destination before it left, emerging into a past that has not yet become the present from which it departed. The crew has no way of knowing, no way of predicting, no way of preparing for the temporal landscape they will find when they next make contact with the outside universe. This temporal dislocation affects every aspect of life aboard the ship. Long-term planning becomes impossible when you cannot predict how much time will pass between the making of a plan and its execution. Relationships are warped by the knowledge that one partner might age decades, while the other ages days. The accumulation of experience that normally constitutes wisdom becomes unreliable when the experiences themselves may not have occurred in the order they are remembered, or may not have occurred at all, but being instead the products of temporal loops and paradoxes that the warp creates with the casual indifference of a child splashing in a puddle. The Night Lords of Aaron Dembski-Bowden's novels provide a vivid illustration of this phenomenon. The warriors of the 8th Legion, who fought at the Siege of Terror 10,000 years ago, speak of that battle as though it happened recently, because for them, subjectively, it did. The warp travel that carried them from battle to battle compressed millennia of real space-time into centuries or even decades of subjective experience, so that warriors who should be ancient beyond imagining are, by their own reckoning, merely old. They remember the heresy. They remember their Primarch. But they remember the brothers who fell beside them in battles that the Imperium has long since classified as ancient history. And they carry these memories as fresh wounds, as recent losses, as yesterday's defeats that still burn with the sharp, immediate pain of the newly bereaved. For the mortal crew, the temporal effects are even more disorienting. A slave captured from an imperial world might spend what feels like a few years aboard a chaos ship, only to discover, if they ever manage to return to real space, that their homeworld has been dead for centuries, its sun burnt out, its people extinct, its very name forgotten by the Imperium that once protected it. The slave's personal history becomes a fossil, a record of a time that no longer exists in a universe that has moved on without them. And they are stranded in the present, with memories of a past that is further away than they can comprehend. And the grief of this discovery, when it comes, is absolute and irredeemable. Some Chaos Space Marines have used this temporal instability as a weapon. There are accounts of warbands deliberately seeking out warp currents that will carry them backward in time, allowing them to attack targets in the past, before the targets have had a chance to prepare their defenses. These temporal raids are rare and unpredictable, because the warp does not cooperate willingly with attempts to manipulate its temporal properties. But when they succeed, they are devastating, striking at the foundations of the enemy's timeline and undermining their certainty that the past is secure and the future is knowable. The long-term psychological effects of temporal dislocation on the crew of a chaos ship are profound and largely incurable. The slaves develop a peculiar relationship with time, one that is characterized by a deep indifference to the passage of hours and days, and a simultaneous, desperate attachment to the moments of genuine human connection that punctuate their existence. Time, for them, is not a river flowing in one direction, but a sea, vast and formless and unpredictable, in which they float without reference points, without landmarks, without any means of determining where they are or where they are going. The only anchors they have are each other, and even those anchors are unreliable, because any person they form a bond with might age to dust before their eyes, or might simply vanish one day, swallowed by the ship's organic interior, or taken by the warp, or killed in one of the countless small violences that punctuate daily existence. This experience of temporal dislocation is, in a sense, the ultimate expression of the chaos ship's nature. Because what is chaos, at its most fundamental level, if not the dissolution of order? And what is time, if not the most fundamental order of all, the framework within which all other experiences occur, the axis upon which the wheel of existence turns? To live aboard a chaos ship is to live in a place where this framework has been shattered, where the most basic assumptions about the nature of reality no longer apply, where everything you thought you knew about how the universe works has been revealed as a comforting illusion maintained by forces that have grown tired of maintaining it. And yet people adapt, they survive, they find ways to construct meaning and purpose, and even something resembling happiness in an environment that should, by all rational analysis, make these things impossible. This is the paradox at the heart of life aboard a chaos warship. The conditions are inhuman, designed at every level to strip away everything that makes a person human. But the people who endure these conditions refuse to stop being people. They refuse to stop caring about each other, even when caring is dangerous. They refuse to stop creating, even when creation is pointless. They refuse to stop hoping, even when hope is the cruelest joke the universe has to offer. This stubborn, irrational, beautiful refusal to be broken is the one thing that the Chaos Gods, for all their power, yet have never been able to fully understand or fully defeat. They can corrupt the body. They can warp the mind. They can twist the soul into shapes that its owner would not recognize. But they cannot quite extinguish the spark, that tiny, flickering flame of defiance that burns in the chest of every human being who has ever lived, whether they lived in a palace or a prison, or the belly of a nightmare ship sailing through a dimension of pure madness. There is another dimension to life aboard a chaos ship that we must explore before we conclude. One that is deeply personal and rarely spoken of in the broader lore, but that is absolutely central to understanding the lived experience of those trapped within these vessels. Let us talk about identity, about who you are when everything around you is designed to make you forget. On an imperial world, our identity is a given. You are a citizen of the Imperium. You are a servant of the Emperor. You are a worker in a hive, a soldier in a regiment, a priest in a parish, a noble in a court. Your identity is defined by your place in a structure so vast and so old that it feels eternal, unchangeable, as much a part of the natural order as gravity or the passage of seasons. Even in the most miserable circumstances, even in the deepest underhive or the most brutal penal colony, you know who you are. You have a name, you have a history, you have a place in the world, however wretched that place might be. Aboard a chaos ship, identity is not a given. It is a battleground. The forces that operate aboard these vessels are, whether deliberately or inadvertently, in the business of identity destruction. The warp erodes memory, blurring the details of who you were before the ship claimed you. The gods demand a redefinition of self, asking you to replace your old identity with a new one built around devotion and service to powers that care nothing for the person you used to be. The social structure of the ship reduces you to a function, a worker, a fighter, a sacrifice, a resource, stripping away everything that is not directly useful to your masters and their war. And the passage of time, that distorted, unreliable flow that bears no relationship to the clocks you once knew, undermines the narrative continuity that is the foundation of all personal identity, the sense that your life is a story with a beginning, a middle, and a direction. The result is that many of the mortals aboard a chaos ship do not know who they are. Not in the sense of amnesia, though that certainly occurs, but in the deeper sense of not possessing a coherent self, of being a collection of responses and reflexes and habits, without a central organizing principle to give them meaning. They work because they are told to work. They eat because their bodies demand food. They sleep because exhaustion overwhelms them. But they do not know why any of this matters, or whether it matters at all, or what the word matter even means, in a context where meaning itself has been corrupted beyond recognition. This existential dissolution is, in a very real sense, the most dangerous weapon in the Chaos God's arsenal. More dangerous than the plagues of Nurgle, or the berserker fury of Khorne, or the sorceries of Tzeentch, or the seductions of Slanesh. Yes, because a person who has lost their sense of self is a person who has lost the ability to resist. They cannot defy an order that conflicts with their values because they no longer have values. They cannot refuse a temptation that violates their principles because they no longer have principles. They cannot even recognize that they are being corrupted because they no longer have a baseline of uncorrupted identity against which to measure the changes that are being wrought upon them. And yet, as we have noted, some resist. Some find ways to maintain a sense of self in the face of pressures that should make selfhood impossible. They do it through memory, clinging to fragments of their past with a tenacity that borders on obsession, repeating names and dates and places to themselves like mantras, writing them on the walls of their cells in whatever medium is available. scratching them into their own skin if necessary. Anything to preserve the thread of personal narrative that connects them to who they were before the ship swallowed them whole. They do it through relationship, through the bonds they form with other slaves, bonds that serve as mirrors, reflecting back to each person a version of themselves that is recognizable and human. I know who I am because you know who I am. I exist because you acknowledge my existence. In a world where every other source of validation has been stripped away, the simple act of being seen by another human being becomes the most precious gift imaginable. They do it through defiance, through small, meaningless acts of resistance that serve no practical purpose, but that affirm the existence of a will that is separate from the ship's will, a desire that is not the same as the gods' desires, a choice that belongs to the individual and not to the system that contains them, a slave who deliberately drops a tool, a worker who takes an extra moment to rest when no one is watching, a mother who whispers her child's name, their real name, the one that no master ever gave them, in the darkness of the sleeping quarters. These acts are so small that the Chaos Space Marines who rule the ship would not consider them worthy of notice, let alone punishment. But to the people who perform them, they are everything. They are proof. Proof that something in them remains untouched, uncorrupted, unbroken. This struggle for identity is, in the end, the central drama of life aboard a Chaos ship. Not the battles, spectacular though they are. Not the political intrigues, complex though they certainly become. Not even the relationship with the gods, terrifying though it is. The true drama is this small, quiet, intensely personal struggle of ordinary human beings to remain human in circumstances that are specifically designed to make them something else. Let us also discuss, as we draw toward our conclusion, the question of what happens when a Chaos ship is finally destroyed. Because even these ancient, corrupted, warp-sustained vessels are not truly immortal. They can be killed. They can be reduced to drifting wreckage by sufficient application of Imperial firepower, or by the weapons of rival Chaos fleets, or by the hazards of the Eye of Terror itself. Those warp storms and gravitational anomalies and predatory entities that make the Eye as dangerous to its inhabitants as it is to any intruder. When a Chaos ship dies, the experience of its destruction is different from that of an Imperial vessel. An Imperial ship breaks apart according to the laws of physics. Its hull fractures along structural lines. Its atmosphere vents through breaches in predictable patterns. Its crew die of decompression, of fire, of impact trauma, of the cold of space. It is violent and horrible, but it is understandable. It follows rules. When a Chaos ship dies, the rules stop applying. The demonic entities that inhabit its systems are released from their bindings, flooding through the dying vessel in a tide of unrestricted warp energy. The organic components of the hull convulse and writhe, the ship's pain. If pain is what a demon-possessed starship feels, manifesting as physical spasms that crush compartments and twist corridors into impossible shapes, the warp energy that has been contained within the vessel's structure for millennia is unleashed in a torrent that warps reality in its immediate vicinity, creating temporary rifts through which demons pour into the material universe, and through which the souls of the dying crew are sucked into the Imperium, there to face whatever fate the Chaos gods have decreed for them. The Chaos Space Marines aboard a dying ship have the best chance of survival, their transhuman constitutions and power armor giving them the ability to withstand conditions that would kill a mortal instantly. Some make it to escape pods or shuttles. Some are teleported to nearby friendly vessels. Some simply survive in the vacuum of space long enough to be picked up, their enhanced biology sustaining them through minutes or even hours of exposure that would be immediately fatal to an ordinary human. The mortal crew are not so fortunate. When the ship begins to die, the slaves and serfs and cultists who make up the bulk of its population are, for the most part, doomed. They do not have power armor. They do not have escape pods allocated for their use. They do not have friends on nearby ships who might be willing to risk their own vessel to pick up a cargo of worthless mortals. They die in the corridors, in the engine rooms, in the gun decks, in the sleeping quarters. They die by fire and by vacuum and by the claws of demons that no longer have any reason to restrain themselves. And they die by the ship itself, at the dying vessel's final convulsions crushing and consuming those who have lived within its belly for years or decades or lifetimes. It is a terrible death, but for many of the ship's mortal inhabitants, it is also, in a grim and paradoxical way, a release. Death ends the slavery. Death ends the fear. Death ends the slow, relentless erosion of everything that once made them who they were. It is the one freedom that the Chaos Gods cannot revoke, the one escape that no amount of warp energy can prevent, the one mercy that the universe, in all its cruelty, still extends to those who have suffered long enough. Unless, of course, the gods decide otherwise. There are accounts, unconfirmed but persistent, of the crew of destroyed Chaos ships being reclaimed by their patron gods, their souls preserved in the warp and installed in new vessels. A new ship, a new body, a new sentence of servitude that begins where the last one ended. Whether these accounts are true or merely the fears of slaves projected onto the lore of their captors is impossible to determine, but the fear itself is real, and it adds one more layer of horror to the experience of life aboard a Chaos ship. The fear that even death is not an escape, the fear that the nightmare has no ending because the gods who authored it have decreed that it shall continue forever in this form or another, aboard this ship or the next, in this life or the life that comes after. There is a poetry to the Chaos warship that is dark and terrible and strangely beautiful. It is a microcosm of the Warhammer 40,000 universe itself, a place where the grandest themes of the setting, the struggle between order and chaos, the relationship between power and corruption, the question of what it means to be human in a universe that seems determined to strip away every last vestige of humanity, are concentrated and distilled into a single, floating, screaming, rotting, burning, dreaming vessel that carries its cargo of damned souls through an ocean of nightmares toward a destination that it may or may not ever reach. The ship does not care whether it reaches its destination. The gods do not care whether the ship reaches its destination. The only ones who care are the people aboard it, the mortals and the transhumans and the demons and the things that are all three simultaneously and none of them completely. They care because caring is what sentient beings do, even when caring is the most dangerous and most painful thing they can possibly do. But they care because to stop caring would be to surrender the last thing that separates them from the metal and the madness that surrounds them. And so, they endure. They adapt. They survive. They create tiny pockets of meaning in the vast, howling void of meaninglessness. And they do it again, and again, and again, for as long as the ship carries them and the gods permit them to draw breath. That is what it means to live aboard a Chaos warship. It means existing in the space between humanity and monstrosity, between sanity and madness, between life and something that uses the same word but means something entirely different. It means waking each day, or each cycle, or each moment, because days and cycles and moments are unreliable concepts aboard these vessels and choosing to continue. Not because continuation is pleasant, not because there is hope of rescue or reward or rest, but because continuation is the one act of defiance that is always available, the one rebellion that even the gods of chaos cannot fully suppress. The ship sails on, the warp churns around it, the gods watch from their thrones of skulls and pestilence and change and sensation, and somewhere in the deepest, darkest, most forgotten corner of the vessel, a human being, small and fragile and absurdly, gloriously stubborn, refuses to stop being human. Not because it is easy, not because it is wise, but because it is the only thing they have left, and they will be damned, literally and completely and without reservation, before they let anyone take it away. Let us also pause and consider the sounds of such a ship one more time. Because if you can understand the sounds, you can understand everything else. A Chaos warship is never silent. Even in the quietest hours, when the engines are at low power and the crew is asleep and the guns are cold, there is always noise. It is layered and complex and deeply unsettling, like an orchestra tuning up for a performance that will never begin and never end. The lowest layer is the ship's heartbeat, a deep, subsonic throb that you feel more than hear, a vibration that travels through the deck plates and up through the soles of your feet and into the marrow of your bones. This is the sound of the engines, or what passes for engines aboard a vessel that has been corrupted by 10,000 years of warp exposure. The pulse is not regular. It speeds up and slows down according to patterns that suggest intention rather than mechanics, as though the ship is breathing, or thinking, or dreaming. Above this, there is the creak and groan of the hull, the protest of metal and organic matter under the constant stress of containing forces that should not be contained. The hull of a Chaos warship is under perpetual tension, pulled in different directions by the physical forces of space travel and the psychic forces of the warp, and it expresses this tension in sounds that range from deep, resonant booms to high, keening whines that set the teeth on edge and make the hairs on the back of the neck stand at attention. Experienced crew members can read these sounds the way a sailor reads the sound of wind in the rigging, detecting approaching storms and structural weaknesses and the moods of the ship's demon-inhabited systems with a precision that would impress any Imperial Voidmaster. Above the hull sounds, there are the voices. These are the most disturbing layer of the ship's acoustic landscape, and they are present on every Chaos vessel, regardless of size, class, or patron deity. They come from everywhere and nowhere. They speak in languages that the listener cannot identify, but somehow almost understands, delivering messages that are always just on the edge of comprehension, close enough to meaning to be tantalizing, but never close enough to be useful. Some crew members believe these voices are the ship speaking to itself, the various demon-inhabited systems communicating through the medium of sound, rather than through the data links and Vox networks that serve the same function on an Imperial vessel. Others believe the voices are the warp bleeding through, more fragments of the Imperium's infinite psychic noise penetrating the hull and manifesting as audible sound. Still others believe the voices are the dead, the accumulated ghosts of every being who has lived and died aboard the ship over the course of its long and bloody history, their final moments preserved in the ship's corrupted structure like insects in amber, replaying endlessly in the darkness of the lower decks and the spaces between the walls. The truth is probably all of these things and none of them. The truth is that a Chaos warship exists at the intersection of so many different types of reality, mechanical and organic, physical and psychic, material and immaterial, that the concept of a single, definitive explanation for any phenomenon is essentially meaningless. The voices are what they are. They speak what they speak. And the crew learns to live with them the way the crew of any ship learns to live with the creaks and groans and whispers that are part of their vessel's character, tuning them out when they can and listening carefully when they must. There is one more sound that deserves mention, though it is heard only rarely and under very specific circumstances. It is the sound the ship makes when it is genuinely happy. Not the simulated satisfaction of a successful weapons discharge or the mechanical purr of engines running at optimal efficiency, but the deep, resonant, almost musical hum that the entire vessel produces when all of its systems, mechanical and demonic and organic and psychic, are in alignment, when the ship is doing exactly what it was made to do and doing it well. This sound is most often heard during battle. When the ship's weapons are firing and its engines are straining and its crew is killing and dying in the service of whatever dark purpose has brought them to this particular fight. It is a sound that makes the crew feel invincible, a psychic resonance that amplifies their aggression and suppresses their fear and fills them with a savage joy that is not entirely their own. It is the ship's joy, the ship's hunger satisfied, the ship's purpose fulfilled, however briefly, before the battle ends and the silence returns and the waiting begins again. This sound, more than anything else, reveals the true nature of a chaos warship. It is not a tool. It is not a vehicle. It is not even a weapon. Though it functions as all of these things, it is a predator. It was built as a machine of war. And the millennia of corruption have not changed that fundamental purpose. They have merely stripped away the layers of civilization and rationality that once disguised it, revealing the raw, hungry, joyful killer that was always lurking beneath the surface, waiting for permission to emerge. This is the final and perhaps most important thing to understand about life aboard a chaos warship. You are not living aboard a ship. You are living inside a predator. And every moment of your existence, every breath you take, every step you take, every thought that passes through your mind is happening inside the body of a creature that is infinitely more powerful than you, infinitely older than you, and infinitely more patient than you. It will wait for you to tire. It will wait for you to falter. It will wait for you to forget, for a single, a careless moment, that you are prey, and then it will consume you, not all at once, because that would be wasteful, but slowly, gently, almost tenderly, the way a spider wraps its catch in silk, preserving you for later, keeping you alive and useful and productive for as long as possible before finally, inevitably, completing the process that began the moment you first stepped aboard. This is the sound of a chaos warship. This is the feel of it. This is the smell and the taste and the touch of it. This is what it means to live inside a thing that has been corrupted by the darkest forces in the universe, but that was, once upon a time, 10,000 years ago, built by human hands and filled with human hopes and sent out into the stars, carrying the dream of a better tomorrow. That dream is dead. It has been dead for a very long time, but its ghost lingers in the corridors and the engine rooms and the gun decks and the slave quarters, a faint and fading echo of something that was good and true and noble, now twisted beyond all recognition into just another weapon in the arsenal of beings who have forgotten what goodness feels like. Or perhaps not forgotten. Perhaps the ghost of that old dream is not a weapon at all, but a wound, a place where the ship's corruption is incomplete, a crack in the armor of madness through which something small and stubborn and defiantly human continues to shine. Perhaps that is why the slaves sing. Perhaps that is why they tell their stories and name their children and scratch their memories into the walls. Perhaps that is why, after 10,000 years of darkness, the light has not quite gone out. Perhaps. We have been walking the corridors of these nightmare vessels for a long time now, you and I. We have seen things that no sane person should see. We have breathed air that no clean lung should breathe. We have met beings whose existence defies everything we understand about what it means to be human, or to be alive, or to be real. And I think it is time to pause, to take a breath, to step back from the details, and consider what all of this means in the larger context of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Because the existence of chaos warships and the lives of the beings who inhabit them raises questions that go beyond the lore of a tabletop game or the pages of a novel. These are questions about the nature of power and corruption, about the relationship between belief and reality, and about what happens when the structures that hold a civilization together, law, morality, faith, identity, are stripped away and replaced by nothing but raw, unmediated contact with forces that are older and more powerful than humanity itself. The Imperium of man, for all its countless flaws, for all its staggering cruelty and bottomless hypocrisy, provides its citizens with something that chaos does not. It provides structure, order, meaning. The imperial creed tells its followers that there is a God, that he loves them, that he protects them, that their suffering has purpose and their lives have value. Whether this is true or not, whether the emperor of mankind is actually a god or merely the most powerful human being who ever lived, as is ultimately less important than the fact that billions of people believe it to be true and derive from that belief the strength to endure lives of unimaginable hardship. Aboard a chaos ship, this structure has been replaced by something else. Not the absence of structure, because the chaos gods provide their own kind of order, their own kind of meaning, their own kind of purpose. But it is an order that serves the interests of beings who do not care about humanity, except as a resource to be exploited. It is a meaning that requires the surrender of everything that makes a person human. And it is a purpose that has no endpoint, no ultimate goal, no destination. Only the endless, churning, self-consuming process of corruption, violence, and worship that sustains the dark gods and the servants who orbit them like moths around a flame. This is what makes the Chaos ship such a powerful and enduring element of Warhammer 40,000 lore. It is not simply a setting for battles and adventures. It is a metaphor, a concentrated expression of the universe's darkest themes, a floating laboratory where the experiments that the Chaos gods wish to perform on all of reality are tested, refined, and perfected before being unleashed upon the wider galaxy. To understand life aboard a Chaos ship is to understand, in microcosm, the nature of chaos itself, the seductive, corrosive, all-consuming force that threatens to swallow the galaxy and everything in it. And yet, even in this darkest of dark places, there are stories of resistance, of defiance, of the human spirit refusing to be extinguished even when every force in the universe is conspiring to snuff it out. Yet the slaves who whisper prayers to the Emperor in the darkness, the mortals who help each other survive against impossible odds, the occasional, rare, precious individual who finds a way to escape, to carry their story back to the Imperium as a warning and a testament to the horrors they endured. These stories are small. They are insignificant in the context of a galactic war that has been raging for 10,000 years. But they matter. They matter because they prove that the human spirit is tougher than even the gods of chaos believe, that there is something in us, something small and fierce and stubborn, that refuses to surrender no matter how dark the night becomes. There you have it. Life aboard a chaos warship. It is not a life that anyone would choose, not if they truly understood what the choice entailed. But for the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of souls who are currently drawing breath aboard these vessels, it is the only life they know. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, even the worst life imaginable is, to those who live it, simply life. The corridors still echo with the sounds we described at the beginning. The not quite hum, the not quite scream, the grinding of ancient metal against itself. The ship breathes, the ship remembers, the ship hungers. And somewhere in the deepest, darkest corner of its corrupted interior, as a slave who was born aboard this vessel and has never known any other world leans against a bulkhead that pulses with something that might be warmth and closes their eyes and tries to imagine what stars look like from the surface of a world where the air is clean and the ground is solid, and the gods, if they exist at all, are distant enough to be ignored. They cannot quite picture it, but they try. And in the trying, they remain, against all odds, human. And that, perhaps, is the most remarkable thing of all. If you enjoyed this journey into the deepest and darkest corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, I would really appreciate it if you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means more than you know. It helps us continue exploring the lore, the stories, and the mysteries of this incredible setting. And if there is a topic you would like us to cover next, drop it in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe out there. The void is darker than you think, and the things that live in it are always hungry. Take care.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.